One of the nicest parts about having a large family is when you get to visit them for the holidays. And in 2016, I was going to do just that. At the time, I had been living in Northern California and decided to go stay with my parents for the holidays at their cabin in Colorado. I was planning it as a huge surprise too, and originally I had intended on just showing up unannounced. But instead, I came up with an idea that I thought would be infinitely better. I was going to show up at the cabin a few days before them, so that when they showed up, I could have it decorated for them. It was going to be amazing. So I figured out that my parents were going to be showing up at the cabin on December 20th of that year, and decided to go there 2 days before them. But to make sure that I didn't accidentally spill the beans, I made sure not to talk to them at all after the 15th, to give myself some time to prepare. Now, if I had spoken to them, I would have found out that they had to cancel their flights to Colorado due to a blizzard that was set to hit on the 20th. But I had no clue, and on December 18th, I flew to Colorado and caught a ride to my parents' cabin, where I used the key that I had on my keychain to get in. The first night I just relaxed, but the entire next day I spent putting up the lights and setting up the living room to look nice for them when they showed up. But as the sun began to set, I noticed that it was starting to snow outside, and I immediately grew concerned. It only got worse from there. It was about 1 in the morning when I noticed the power went out around me, and I decided to give up on my surprise plan and called my parents to see if there was a generator. And as soon as they realized I was at the cabin, they freaked out. But not in the way that seemed like they were excited. They were immediately concerned and let me know that there was a really intense snowstorm heading my way. And when I told them that the power had gone out, they only worried more. You see, the driveway leading up to the cabins was a gravel path through the woods that spanned the length of about 2 football fields. In other words, with the snow piling up the way that it was, there was no way for me to get out. And to make matters worse, I didn't bring much food because I assumed my family would be bringing some. All I could do at that point was hope that the storm passed sooner than expected and I could get out of there. That wasn't the case though. It snowed for 5 days straight, and the service roads leading up to the mountain that I was on had apparently been shut down. My phone's battery was low, so I decided to turn it off for use in an emergency. And from that moment on, I spent most of my time reading anything that I could. I managed to keep the cabin warm using the wood that I had piled up the night that I got in, and I melted snow on the wood stove to make drinking water. But by the time the 4th day rolled around, I was starving. I hadn't had anything to eat in over 48 hours and was getting really desperate. I looked in the cabinets and ended up finding 3 cans of ravioli that had been in there for years, if not longer. At that point, I would have eaten anything though, so I didn't waste any time putting the can directly on the wood stove to begin heating up its contents. It only took me 10 minutes before realizing how bad of a decision I had made. In no time at all, I was keeled over, clenching my stomach in pain. I turned my phone on and called my parents to see if they thought it was serious. And after realizing the food that I had eaten was more than likely more than a decade old, they had me call the hospital, which transferred me over to poison control. That's when I learned how terrifying botulism was. According to the person I spoke to, if I didn't get help soon, there was a chance that my body would become deeply infected and I could ultimately die. They ended up sending a helicopter to airlift me to the hospital since the roads were still closed in the area around my cabin, and I'm glad they did. By the time they got there, which was only an hour after my call, I had developed a fever over 106 degrees and could feel an intense heat coursing through my body. I was hospitalized for 3 days afterward, 2 of which were spent simply monitoring my vitals and making sure that my organs hadn't been damaged.
Back in 2017, I worked as a delivery driver for Uber Eats to make some extra money on the side. It wasn't the best paying job, but it was something to help me get by my struggles as a growing adult. I was 25 years old, and I'm sure most of you know how life really sets in at that age. Anyway, I live in the suburbs of New York. Not the city, just the state, as I was never a city person, but lived near it. Throughout my life, I've always been more of a quiet person, which is why I really like the suburban areas. One night, I was doing some late night delivery orders to keep the income flowing when there had been an incoming weather report. The snow had been falling pretty hard and the winds were measuring well over 50 kilometers and that a blizzard was on its way. That being said, I still wanted to do a few more orders for the night. Luckily, I had received one order from someone on the other side of town. It wasn't too far, but this person barely met the delivery radius. I was annoyed because of the distance, but I realized it was another tip. I bit my lip and drove to the restaurant and to the given address. All the while, the falling snow began to come down fast and the winds were starting to pick up. On top of that, the snow on the sidewalks were already starting to pile up, so I knew I had to get there in time. I arrive at the destination and there's this man standing outside of his terrace house wearing several layers of clothing. Just by looking at him, he did not seem like a pleasant type of man. It was one of those men that screamed stranger danger. He comes up to my car and I proceed to hand him his food when he begins to ask for some money. I ask him what it was for, to which he then says that his car had been out of gas. Okay, so I wasn't sure why that was my problem, but being nice and not wanting to piss him off, I hand him a $10 bill and wished him luck. He looked down at the money and then looked back at me with a blank expression as if he wanted more. He then said that it wasn't enough and that I could at least do 50. I told him that was all I had, but that maybe someone else could help him. The look on his face that day is something that will never leave me. It was a look of hatred and anger, as if I were his sworn enemy. I then tell him to enjoy and drove off away from the building. Doing that, however, was probably the most stupidest decision of my life. I hear two loud bangs echo through the streets along with something hitting my back tire. It didn't take me long to realize that these bangs were actually gunshots. Suddenly my car swerves from left to right and the ice didn't make it any better. Eventually, I managed to get a hold of the wheel and drive back with my back tire making this awful noise. However, I was afraid of what might happen if I stopped my car in case he was following me somehow. Thankfully, I had gotten home safely just in time and didn't once look back. Police were called and I reported the incident to Uber, but nothing ever became of it. After all, this did happen in the Bronx, which isn't the safest place in the city. I guess I learned my lesson not to assume that everything I do is safe, when in reality, it isn't. It was the fall of 2015 and I just finished my first semester in college, meaning winter break would finally be upon me. I live in upstate New York, and around this time of year, it would become exceedingly cold in my area with temperatures dropping below the 30s. Growing up in the cold, I wasn't bothered by it and actually enjoyed it to a certain extent. One night, my mom had been out with a friend, leaving me to tend to the house alone. I didn't mind staying alone, as I like to think of myself as mature and responsible, and I could really use the quiet. Now, the house we lived in was located in the more rural side of my city. It wasn't like the country, but houses here were far apart and the nearest grocery store was about 9 miles. With nothing to do, I throw myself onto my couch and put on some Netflix to fall asleep to. So there I am, bored out of my mind, watching Orange is the New Black when the power goes out. Living in a cold area where the winds are strong, it wasn't uncommon for it to go out once in a while. With nothing to do at this point, I closed my eyes and tried to fall asleep until my parents came home. I probably slept on the couch for about a good 2 hours when I for some reason wake up. The power is still out, so I couldn't see anything in the room other than the faint glow from the moon. However, I started having this weird feeling in the room. You know that sensation you get when you can just feel someone's watching you? Yeah, I had that in spades. I sat bolt upright while letting my eyes adjust to the dark, and right then I could see the outline of something tall beside the couch. By some miracle, the power comes back on, and about 2 feet away is a man standing over me. He looked to be in his mid-30s, was very tall and lanky, wearing a torn white shirt and some cargo pants. The thing that made the situation 10 times creepier was the fact that parts of his clothes were covered in blood. My blood ran cold as he stared down at me with this menacing glare of utter shock. I say I stared at him for a good 10 seconds before he says something along the lines of, who are you? I say in an angry tone, who are you and what the hell are you doing inside of my house? He then went on to explain that he was driving when his car skidded across the road from the ice, crashing into a large tree, and he came to the nearest house looking for help. It didn't take me long to realize that the blood on his clothes was his. In the heat of the moment, I thought his story was bullshit, but I didn't want to be rude. I tell him that there was nothing I could do and that if he didn't leave, I would call the cops. He didn't respond to this and started walking around the living room looking for stuff. Needless to say, I called the police and explained the situation to the operator. They said that it could take a while for an officer to get here due to the extreme weather conditions. I'm 5'8", that weighed around 150 pounds, and this guy was massive, so I couldn't take him on even if I tried. All the while, he's going through cabinets, opening doors, and wouldn't listen to me when I told him to stop. I could only assume that he was on something and prayed the police would be here soon. Turns out, his so-called bullshit story turned out to be 100% true. 2 police officers came to my door 15 minutes later and told me that he was indeed in a car crash. I felt so bad for him, assuming he was an intruder when the guy was just wanting some help. Apparently, the impact of the crash shocked him to the point where he didn't know what he was doing, which explained him searching through my living room. Long story short, he was sent to a hospital and me nor my mom pressed any charges. My parents didn't let me stay home alone after that until a few years later. This is by far the most strangest incident I've ever come across in my 9 years of living in that house. Even though I felt sympathy for the man, this story still scares me till this day. I'm 22 now and I have moved past it. But there's still one question I have. How did he get inside of my house? The thing is, my parents always keep our doors locked.
Many years ago, when I was a kid, I used to go sledding with my younger brother every time it snowed. There was a hill at a park a few blocks away, and we could walk to it. Every time it snowed, we would go there, and all the kids from the neighborhood would go to it as well. One year, when I was about 10, me and my little brother, who was 2 years younger than me, noticed it was snowing out. It was already nighttime, but as it was a Friday, we knew the next day our local hill would be packed with kids, so we asked our mom if we could go that night. I don't know exactly what time it was looking back, but I'd guess it was about 7 or 8 o'clock. Our mom said we could, but we had to be back within an hour. My brother and I got on our winter coats and snow pants and took our sleds to the hill. It took maybe 10 minutes for us to walk to the park, and as we were walking, the snowfall got heavier and heavier. By the time we got there, it was really coming down, and we saw that there was nobody else at the park at all. The hill was getting coated in fresh snow. My brother and I raced up to the top and then slid down. It was great to have the whole park to ourselves, sliding down and going back up over and over again. One of the times when we reached the top of the hill, we noticed a man standing towards the bottom of it. He was really far away, but he appeared to just be staring at us. It was kind of weird to see an empty park at night in the middle of a blizzard with just one man standing at the bottom of a hill staring. My brother and I decided to wait for a minute or so to see if he would go away before we slid down the hill again. He kept standing there for at least a minute or so, maybe 2, and finally walked about 20 feet away and sat on a park bench, but continued to watch us. My brother and I were naturally taught to be careful of strangers, and the guy was seeming suspicious. We decided to slide down the hill one more time and then leave the park to go home. When we got to the bottom, I saw a closer look of the man. He seemed sort of old, but I couldn't make out much else in the snowfall and him wearing a big coat. My brother and I then walked out of the park and left. We walked home in the snow for roughly the 10-minute walk. When we made it back home, we got back inside and had some hot chocolate. After that, we got ready for bed. As I was going down the hallway from the bathroom to my bedroom, I noticed something out the window. The man who we had seen at the park was standing at the edge of our yard on the street, staring at our house. I called my brother over, and just after he got there, we watched the man walk away. He didn't get into a car or anything, he just walked down the street. But after that, he was never seen again. A couple of years ago, I was going on a long road trip for work, which I did quite often with my old job. It was winter time, and as I drove down the road late at night, I noticed it start to snow. Pretty soon, it was a heavy snowfall that was sticking on the ground and causing the road to become very slippery and dangerous to drive on. I hadn't really been paying attention to the weather, but I knew at this point it would be dangerous to continue. I decided to pull off the freeway at the next stop, hoping there would be some hotels or something. Unfortunately, there were none, and the next stop was just a truck stop. I pulled into it off the freeway anyways, and saw a decent amount of trucks and other cars there. The place was starting to get busy from all the snow and the people getting off the roads. I went around and parked in an open parking spot, and decided to just sleep there and wait out the snow. It was a busy road I had been on, so I figured it would get plowed overnight. I went inside the truck stop to use the bathroom, and then walked back out to my car. As I did, I could already see almost an inch of snow had fallen onto my car. I got into my car and began covering up my windows. I did the same thing for whenever I slept in my car. I covered all the windows with certain blankets that I had, so nobody could see in the car at all. Then I laid in the back seats of my car, which was just long enough for me to lay down in. I had several other blankets that I had in back with me, so I wasn't too worried about getting cold. I closed my eyes, and it didn't take long for me to fall asleep, but I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. I had no idea what time it was. I'd been sleeping well, so I knew something had woken me up. I couldn't see out of any of my windows because of the blankets. Then I heard the sound of a scratching coming from the outside of my car. It got louder and louder. It sounded like it was on my driver's side. It stopped for a minute, but eventually I heard someone try to open the driver's door to my car. I wasn't quite sure what to do because nothing like this had ever happened before. I laid there for about a minute as whoever was there tried to enter my car, testing out each door one at a time. I was really happy that my car was locked. I looked at my phone and thought about calling the police. It was 4:30 in the morning. Then the noises stopped, until suddenly I heard a loud bang come from the back window next to me. Thankfully, the window didn't break, but I thought it might, so I jumped and got into the driver's seat and started the car. I pulled the blanket off the window and drove away. I could feel myself sliding in the snow as I did. I looked in my mirror and saw someone, but couldn't make out anything about them. It was snowy and dark, and they were a good 30 feet behind me. I kept driving back onto the road, which was not as slippery as it had been before, but it was still lightly snowing. I slowly and carefully drove up about 20 miles to a town with a hotel and slept there the rest of the night. This happened when I was 15. I was a sophomore in high school and got home from school one afternoon in December to realize I was home alone. I saw a note on the counter from my mom saying that her and my dad were going shopping and would be back later that night. She left me some money to order a pizza, which I was pretty excited about. I did my homework, then ordered the pizza and watched TV. Then I played some video games. It had been snowing earlier in the day, and by the time it was 7 p.m., it was really coming down. I kept playing video games, and finally at about 9, my mom called me telling me she was on her way home, but might not be there for another hour or so because of the snow. I decided to go outside and look to see just how much we had gotten. I was also going to maybe shovel the driveway. I stepped out the front door to see several inches of fresh snow everywhere. It was so smooth, except for this one place. I noticed some footprints in the snow that were in my yard. There seemed to be someone who walked in my yard and then went over to the garage. It was strange to me. There usually weren't people walking in my yard. I went back inside and suddenly had the thought to check the garage door, which was connected to our house. I went over to it and saw that it was unlocked. I started to walk closer to lock it, but thought I heard a noise right from the other side of it. This really freaked me out, and I ran upstairs to my room. I locked my door and hid under my bed. About a minute later, I heard the noise of my garage door opening. I wanted my parents to get home badly, but knew they wouldn't be home for almost an hour. I heard the sounds of someone walking around downstairs in my house. At that point, I decided to call the police. Thankfully, I had my phone on me, and I dialed 911. I spoke as quietly as I could, and hoped whoever was downstairs didn't hear me. I could barely hear them walking around downstairs, and I heard them walking around for quite a while. I had no idea what they were doing, but I was kicking myself for not making sure the garage door was locked earlier. I sat upstairs under my bed until I started to hear the footsteps coming up the stairs. It was the most scared I had ever been, until finally I heard the sound of police sirens off in the distance. The footsteps then went back downstairs and seemed to leave. I waited until the police came inside my house to leave my bedroom. When I did, I saw the main level of our house was all messed up. My parents were called and got home a little bit later. It seemed like just a typical break-in of a guy trying to find valuables in our house. I'm just glad I was able to get upstairs and call the police when I did.
My name is Corey, and I lived in the States ever since I could remember. It was around 6 p.m. one night in the winter, and I was staying at my girlfriend's family vacation house due to a snow blizzard. It was our second week there, and the surroundings were astonishing. The house belonged to my girlfriend's grandparents before they passed, and ever since then, we'd always go up there for the winter. Now, the blizzard wasn't too strong, but the snowfall was coming down hard with about 2 feet of snow. We had just eaten lunch, and after that, I decided I'd go on a walk like I always do. I know, stupid to go out in a blizzard, but it was mild and didn't really pose a threat to us. The house was very close to a forest in the mountains, as this was a more rural part of the state. Going outside and enjoying the cold winter forest looked and felt amazing. My girlfriend had even said she would make us some hot cocoa while I was gone. Now, the forest I normally hike in has 2 separate paths. one that has a more rocky terrain and one that doesn't. Playing it safe, I decided I'd take the trail with the least amount of treachery, as I knew there was a risk of slipping due to the slushy ice. Without hesitation, I go through the more smoother trail and didn't think anything of it. I've been through both of these trails in the past, but I didn't feel like doing anything extreme. So there I was, walking through the woods, listening to one of my playlists when my iPod died. Annoyed, I take out my phone and record a few videos of my hike to post on my Instagram story. Not that anyone cared, but I liked recording my experiences wherever I went. It was up until this point that I had been hiking for about a half hour now and was debating on whether to call it a day. However, there had been a small forest clearing just up ahead and decided I'd take a look around. Upon entering the clearing, I immediately noticed strange objects laid out in the snow. The strange part was that they were neatly arranged in a sort of pyramid-like structure. I move a few feet closer, and it was then when I realized that these so-called objects were bones of what seemed like a giant animal. Maybe cow, maybe a horse, or even buffalo. They were completely clean and sun-bleached. This meant that someone out there had placed these on purpose. What that purpose was, I have no idea. I was just on this trail a few days before and had seen no bones. There were also a few bones that were alike and had been neatly arranged in a circle that laid in the snow. Suddenly, the snow began to pick up as I stared down at the bones when I got the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be here. It was then when I heard quite a ways into the woods a loud snap that echoed across the trees. I take a quick photo of my discovery and try my best to run back to the house. All the while, I'm taking big steps into the deep blankets of snow, going as fast as I can. I make it back to the house and show my girlfriend the picture I took. She began to freak out as well, and we both thought why someone would go through the struggle to do this. I'm still not sure if it was just some punk trying to scare people or something much worse. Either way, I haven't been back up there since, but my girlfriend's parents have. This time, the bones were gone.
At the time, I had just turned 12. I had never been left home alone before, and I was really excited to finally be home alone without adult supervision. I began the night by binging movies and playing games on the PlayStation, which my parents had bought me for Christmas. It was still very early in January when this happened. My town had been experiencing a harsh winter that year. It was snowing heavily outside to the point that if you looked outside, you wouldn't even be able to see. I had just put in a frozen pizza in the oven when the doorbell rang. My parents had always told me to not answer the door for anyone because they have a key and they wouldn't need to be let in. I was a curious kid, so despite my best judgment, I went to look out the peephole. However, when I did so, there was no one there. In all honesty, I just brushed it off as someone had the wrong house and left. The more I thought about it, though, the more suspicious I became. As like I said, it was below freezing and it was snowing outside. I went back to the living room to watch my movies. It's important to note that we had just moved in, and we didn't have any curtains in some of the windows, including the window that looked into our living room. At this point, I heard a loud bang come from the kitchen. I assumed something had fell, and as tired as I was, I didn't go see what it was. When I finally had, I had noticed my pizza had been overcooked. I threw it in the trash, and when I had gone back into the living room, I had then noticed someone looking into the living room. I pretended that I didn't see them and tried to discreetly call my parents. To the horror of my 12-year-old heart, They didn't answer. I tried not to panic, and I just went into my parents' bedroom and locked all the doors. I crawled under the bed and once again tried reaching out to my parents. When they did finally answer, I told them what happened, and they rushed home. But by the time they got home, whoever was outside was long gone. I have no idea who it was that was outside or what their intentions were, but I really hope they don't ever return. Hi, my name is Trevor, and this is by far the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. This happened in May of this year. I'm a 22-year-old male who's in pretty good shape, and I'm a first responder, so I've seen and dealt with pretty much everything. I live with my parents in an upper-middle-class community. The town I live in has very little to no crime in it. So here's my story. My parents left to go to Florida to visit some family, and basically left me and my German Shepherd dog alone for the week. A quick layout of the house. It's 2 stories, with my parents' room on the first floor. Anyways, it's night out, and I'm sleeping in my parents' room with my dog. The bed is between 2 windows with screens on them. They were both opened. It's about 2 a.m. and I'm just getting ready to fall asleep when I wake up to the sounds of screaming. I think nothing of it since there's a lot of kids in the area who are always out. But about 10 minutes later, I hear the same screaming again, which woke my dog up, and he was also alerted. I still think nothing of it. Another 10 minutes, the screaming happens again, and I noticed it wasn't a child scream, and it was only one person. It was a loud screaming, sounding like someone was getting stabbed. My dog starts huffing and totally freaking out. I'm now scared shitless and unable to move. 5 minutes later, and the screaming was right outside the window. It was so loud this time that my ears started ringing. My dog flips absolute shit, and I'm having a panic attack. I look out the window, and I see some old woman with long gray hair, and she was still screaming. I finally jump into action, and I grab my dad's pistol. The only bad thing is that it was a revolver, and it had no bullets, so I had to pray she thought it was loaded. I went back to the window, and now she was gone. I dialed 911, and as soon as the operator answered, I then heard the front door glass break. I ran over, and I see this old woman reaching into the window trying to unlock it. The scariest part of all of this was that her arm was rubbing right against the broken glass, cutting her very deep, but she wasn't even reacting to it. She was giving me the 1,000-yard stare while laughing and screaming. I'm literally crying at this point, and I had pointed the gun right at her. She sees the gun, and then just starts yelling.
Do it! I dare you!
And as much as I wanted to, I couldn't since I had no bullets. And then suddenly, I then see lights going down my street. The woman pulls her arm away and starts walking back slowly while still staring at me and laughing. I can then hear the cops yelling, "Drop the knife, ma'am!" The cops took my statement, and I later found out that she was actually a psych patient who had escaped the hospital, and that she even broke into a trailer nearby and stabbed a couple. The last I heard, they were okay, but why my house out of all the others? I had my door fixed and all the blood cleaned up. My parents later called me because they had heard that there was a break-in in the area. I had to tell them it was our house, but to not worry. To that crazy old who tried stabbing me, I hope you're getting the proper care and help that you need. This happened when I was 15. I was visiting my dad for the weekend, as I tend to do often. My half-brother lives with them, and we're very close, and I consider him a full brother. We usually don't do much when I'm over at my father's house. We just hang out and have a good time. Me and my brother play video games in his room mostly, and this time was no different. Until later in the story. Earlier in the day, my dad had some friends over, and we were all outside. We were playing some basketball in the back with all the adults. I had overheard my dad telling them how a few weeks earlier, one of his acquaintances came up to my brother's window and had tried to take out the new AC that my dad had just installed. My dad punched him a few times and injured his hand doing so. We all thought the situation was pretty funny, and we had a little laugh about it, and that was pretty much the end of it. A couple of hours later, everyone left, and we went inside while my brother put his dog in the outdoor cage. He usually stays out there for a couple of hours. Keep that in mind, because it'll be important later. That night, our dad had let us know that he was going to be going out for a few hours, and he gave us the usual spiel. Don't open the door for anyone you don't know. Remember to bring the dog back inside, and don't f*** anything up. And yes, those were his exact words. We gave him the okay, and he was off. Me and my brother were in his room playing some video games and watching some YouTube when the doorbell rang. Me and him just looked at each other, and I told him to go look out the window next to the door and see who it was. I continued playing the game, and I heard my brother open the door. So I assumed it was someone we knew. About a minute went by when I heard it close again, and my brother walked back into the room. I had asked him who it was, and he told me it was Roy. He was the one who my dad beat up. At that point, I was getting a little nervous, and I got upset with my brother for even opening the door for him after what he did. I was confused, and I had asked him why he did that. I had told him what happened, and his face then turned into a look of worry. I then asked my brother what he was talking to Roy about. He went on to explain that Roy had asked if our dad was home. Unfortunately, my brother said no, and Roy just left without saying a word. I can't blame my brother for telling him, because he didn't know at the time. My brother then ran to the kitchen and grabbed 2 knives just to be safe. We closed the bedroom door and we continued playing games. About 15 minutes later, we thought we heard some noises coming from outside. Now, we had the window cracked open because it was summer, and my brother's room always got boiling hot. We both walked over and then slightly pulled open the curtains, but we didn't see anything. We just blamed it on the paranoia getting to us, and then one of the scariest moments of my life then happened. The bag motion sensor light turned on, and the dog started to bark extremely loud, as if the barks were directed at something or someone. Me and my brother's eyes grew 10 times in size. Not only did we forget the dog, but there was something in the backyard. We knew it was a person due to the Roy situation, and the fact that it takes a lot of movement to activate the motion light. We tried to wait it out to see if the dog would start barking, but it didn't. So we then knew we had to go out there and get him. With knives in hand, both me and my brother carefully made our way outside. I was watching him in the door while I grabbed the dog. The dog was facing away from the house deeper into the yard where the light didn't hit, so we knew where whoever was out there was. Just as my brother got the dog untied and was about to run back inside, Roy jumped out from the darkness with a hatchet from my dad's shed, running full speed toward my brother. I screamed at him to look out, but he caught his arm, as my brother struggled to keep Roy from lowering the hatchet onto him. I then ran over and slit Roy's arm with a knife. He dropped the hatchet and then screamed in pain. Me, my brother, and the dog all ran inside and locked everything down. We considered calling the police, but in the end, we decided not to. It would just be one of those things that we always kept between us and no one else. But nonetheless, this is still one of the scariest things that's ever happened to me and my brother. and I really hope no one else has to experience anything like it. This is going to be a short but terrifying story, and it happened to me when I was 15. It still horrifies me to the very second I'm writing this. I was home alone one night during the summer of 2019, and I was doing my normal relaxation activities. You know, TV and video games. My parents were out on a date, and my older brother was at his friend's house, and I had no pets. I was playing Battlefront 2 when I heard two guys talking outside my window. My window was facing the backyard, so it kind of scared me. I turned off my Xbox and then looked out my window. What I saw made my heart beat itself right out of my body. I saw 6 guys in my backyard armed with machetes and wearing these weird cat masks, and they were about to break my window with this giant rock. I grabbed my phone, ran into my room, locked the door, and then called my dad. I told him what was happening, but for some reason, he didn't even believe me. I was furious, so I then hung up on him and called 911. By then, I could hear the men in my house, and they were talking in a language that sounded like Russian. The operator then told me that the officers would be there soon and to stay where I was. She then told me to hang up, which I did. It wasn't even a minute later that I heard 2 pairs of footsteps coming up the stairs, and then to my room. They tried the doorknob, and when they realized it was locked, they then yelled something to the other men. They then started bashing at the door and kicking it, and then I think they actually tried cutting it open with their machetes. They eventually gave up, and I then heard a window outside my room opening, so I guess they escaped. I just stayed in my room when I then heard a man shout, "Police!" I opened my door and rushed downstairs when I saw 3 cops in my living room. They told me the place was clear and that it was safe. They called my parents, and this time they actually believed it and came home. The cops had actually told us that this wasn't the first time this happened, and that within the last week only, there had been 3 other incidents exactly like this. This only made me angrier with my dad, as since this had happened before, he should have believed me even more, but still didn't for some reason. I didn't talk to my dad for days before he finally made it up to me. Parents, please believe your children when they come to you with things like this. It isn't something to be taken lightly. So, about 4 years ago, my parents were going out, and with that, I was going to be home all alone for at least 3 to 4 hours. They left around 6, and they said they would be home around 9 to 12. Whenever they left, I went downstairs. I got some snacks, and I had put on Netflix to then look around for a new show. After like 2 hours of watching a new show, that's when I then heard a very strange noise coming from the front porch. Keep in mind, I have a wraparound porch, and there were a lot of windows looking out. Me being curious, I pulled back the curtains and then looked out into the dark yard. After looking around, nothing seemed off, until I saw a black silhouette of a man standing by the front door. I froze in fear, dropping the curtains, and then ran upstairs into my parents' room. After 5 minutes of waiting, I decided to text my parents. I told them the incident, and surprise, surprise, they didn't believe me, given that I was only 13. I sat there and I thought maybe it was my imagination. I decided to walk back downstairs and finish my show. I realized the motion sensor light in the backyard was now on. You can either turn the light on, or if anyone walks by it, it will turn on automatically. Keep in mind that this light isn't very sensitive. Most time it turns on whenever a person or animal walks by it. Once I realized what was going on, I ran back to my parents' room, once again in tears. I picked up the house phone to call the police, when I then heard a whisper from outside my window. "Hey, I know you're in there. Just come out. Come out here real quick. I just want to talk to you." My heart dropped and was about to beat right out of my chest. I froze in fear, then snapped back and called the police. The 911 operator told me to hide in a closet and to stay quiet. She told me to stay on the line just in case anything else happens. Also, keep in mind that my house is around 15 minutes away from the nearest town. After sitting in my parents' closet, I heard the back door creak. Tears started rolling, as I then heard someone walking around in the kitchen and living room. I told the 911 operator what was happening, and then I heard something fall over downstairs. Then I heard the stairs creaking, and a man walking around the bedrooms. Thank God I locked the bedroom door, because he saw it was locked, and just kept going. Or so I thought. Well, after around 30 seconds, I heard the loudest bang of my life, and with a man screaming. And like a miracle, right after this, I then heard police sirens, and the man running away, and then the back door slamming shut. I ran out, and I saw him running into the woods. I ran outside, and I told the cops everything. And then they took me to my aunt's house, where I waited at for my parents to come home. Ever since this happened, they never did find the man, considering we never really got any details on him. I pray and hope he never returns.
I moved into a new apartment last fall. The apartment was, for the most part, pretty average. I had a one-bedroom on the first floor. It was a corner unit, which was nice. I had a bedroom, bathroom, living room, and kitchen. I was moving into a new state for work and had lived about 2 hours away. When I got to the place, it took me a whole day to move all of my furniture in, but I was able to do it with the help of a coworker. That night, though, something kind of weird happened. I was up pretty late because it was a weekend, and after moving in all of my stuff, I was staying up late by myself watching a movie. At about midnight, I heard a noise coming from outside my door leading to the hallway. It was a man's voice, and it sounded like he was saying, "Jane." He was seemingly calling out for somebody named Jane. At first, I was sort of creeped out. Then, I thought maybe it was just somebody walking down the hall, or one of my neighbors going to their places. I paused the TV and got up, taking a couple of more steps closer to the door. I still heard the man's voice, and I could tell now that it was coming from right outside of my door, and he wasn't moving. Whoever was here must either be one of my neighbors or somebody looking for whoever used to live in my apartment. That's what I was thinking, and whoever did live in my apartment before must have been named Jane. I decided to go out and let this guy know that Jane doesn't live here anymore, and I just moved in. I walked over to the door and opened it, but as I was opening the door, I heard footsteps darting away as if the man was sprinting back down the hallway. When I had opened up the door, I could see down the hallway that the man was gone, but I did just barely see him disappearing around the corner. Why would he try to run away from me? I thought this was pretty strange, but what else could I do? So I went back inside and unpaused my movie. Fast forward to about a week after that. This time, I was in bed sleeping, but was awoken in the middle of the night by a noise. My room was all dark, and it was completely silent, except for a voice. Once again, I heard someone calling out, "Jane." This guy again? What did he want, and who was he? More importantly, where was he? He wasn't outside my door again, or I wouldn't have been able to hear him. It took me a second because I had just woken up, but I realized that whoever it was right outside my bedroom window. I sat up in bed and looked out the window. I saw some guy disappearing out of my view again. I never got a good look at him at all. Now I was really creeped out. This must be some type of mistake. I stayed up, wide awake. I got up and went into my kitchen to get some water. When I was there, I heard another noise coming from the bedroom window. It was like a scratching noise, sort of. I went back into my bedroom, just in time to see that the guy was there again. I saw his face for a good second, and he saw mine. It looked as though maybe he was trying to break in. When he saw me, he stopped and then ran away again. From what I saw, he was either bald or had really short hair and was sort of short and stocky. I stayed up, not sure what to do. The guy seemed to be gone now, but I didn't know if he would come back. I stayed up basically for the entire rest of the night. The man never returned though. The next day, I contacted my apartment and told them about it, and then I went to the police. I was told they would patrol the area. However, the man never did come back. I still wonder who it was. Part of me thinks this guy was stalking a woman named Jane who he thought lived there. Either that, or maybe the guy was crazy, or maybe he was stalking me. I really don't know what to make of it. I'm a 23-year-old male and currently a graduate student at a large university that I want to keep anonymous. To preface this story, I live in a large apartment complex on the 4th story, just a few blocks from campus. And even though the apartment is nice, the area is not. There are lower income projects directly across the street from my apartment, and there are constant police patrols around the area as there are multiple convicted felons living there. I'm very high up from the ground on the 4th floor and far from the stairwell and feel relatively safe until one night. This all happened on the night of my 23rd birthday, and I was coming back to my apartment late. I was pretty tired after all the events and fun that I had, so I just changed out of my clothes and into my boxers and went to sleep. To add more context, I had recently put out a lot of nice small Christmas trees, lights, and decorations, and the whole balcony looked very nice. I could turn the Christmas decor on and off using my computer, so before I went to sleep, I turned off all the lighting. This made my balcony and apartment pitch black. I went to bed and fell asleep pretty quickly. Everything was quiet until all of a sudden I was awoken to a loud noise that sounded like a fence railing rattling. I have a pet rabbit and she sometimes rattles the fence whenever she wants something. I also have a pet camera in my living room area, so I opened up the app on my phone to see what she wanted. However, when I checked the live footage, my rabbit was fast asleep and far from the fencing. I then thought someone must be out on their balcony and accidentally knocked over a plant or something, so I opened up my bedroom door to see what was going on. However, when I turned my head to look out at my balcony, I was jump scared by a medium-sized man with a backwards baseball hat and camo on. I was in pure shock and immediately went back into my room to call the police. After I knew the police were on their way, I poked my head around the door and yelled at the guy to get the F off my balcony. He didn't seem fazed by this and tried to convince me that he was stuck and to let him in so he could get off of my balcony. However, I wasn't born yesterday, and there was no way I was letting this guy on my balcony into my apartment at 4 a.m. The guy kept talking and said his name is Charlie, and I just finally had enough and said that he's lucky he's still standing there. This was enough for him to climb down the side rail of my balcony and onto the 3rd floor. Later, I got a call from the police and asked about his description, but as of now, I haven't heard if he got caught. I filed a police report, and they're currently looking for him. The crazy part about this story is that I live on the 4th floor, so I'm over 40 feet up in the air, and there's about a 12-foot gap of open air between the apartment balconies vertically. There's also a 40-foot gap between my balcony and the stairs on each side. Aside from damaging a cheap flag, he did not steal any of my expensive Christmas decorations. I found this very odd that he wasn't on my balcony just to steal my decorations. Since the incident, I happened to run into some people that live in the building. I told them about how the guy tried to break in and enter my apartment, and I probably scared them badly when I told them this. I recommended that they reinforce their doors with something to keep them shut. That night, I installed an extra camera for the balcony and went to sleep. I didn't hear or see anything when I checked my camera the next day. However, someone claimed that the guy came back and tried to break down their door, but couldn't because of the reinforcement. This scared me a lot because now I knew the person was not there just to steal furniture off balconies. The next night, nothing happened. When I woke up the next day, an idea popped into my head to check the roof area. There's a roof access area in the complex, so I went up and checked it. I didn't see anything at first, but I noticed how one of the planters were pulled out just slightly. This was extremely odd because you had to look at a specific angle to see that this large planter was pulled out. Also, I go up there fairly frequently, and it's usually very clean and orderly. When I looked behind the planter, I was completely horrified. I found a large and heavy brick that looked like it weighed 30 pounds behind the planter. For reference, our apartment building is not made of brick, and when I looked at some brick buildings in the area, I noticed that the brick I found was a lot larger and more malformed than the bricks on the buildings. I immediately called the police, and they looked around on the rooftop that night to see if there was any more evidence, but they said they didn't find anything. The officer told me to dispose of the brick, as they wouldn't be able to get fingerprints off of the surface. It's the next day now, and I know that nothing else happened since last night. However, when I checked the rooftop again, I found another brick, but this time it was hidden in a plant with tall grass. I think he noticed the last brick was gone and went to get another one. I've been really stressed out about this and have not been able to sleep for the past few days. I hope after this time he's given up, but something tells me that he hasn't.
So I've been a delivery driver for about 3 years ever since the start of the pandemic. It's a lot more stressful than people think, and I've dealt with several different customers, but this one takes the prize. It was a Thursday, and I had been doing Uber Eats orders for people who just preferred to stay home. Most of the time, I do orders until really late in order to keep the cash flowing. Since this was around the time where these delivery apps really started to take off, I took advantage of it and worked both Uber Eats and DoorDash. On this particular day, I had been using Uber Eats. Not before long, I had received one order from a house that wasn't too far away, and the order was pretty big, which basically meant an extra tip. I drive to the given restaurant, obtain the order, and drive the 10-minute drive to the given address. On this day, it happened to be raining, and one thing I've always hated was driving in the rain. But I had to make my money somehow. It's about 4 in the afternoon, and as I'm driving, I turn into the road where the house was. Now, in order to get to this house, you'd have to go down this narrow pathway that cuts straight into a wooded area. To say the least, it was pretty much a well-hidden path unless you accidentally stumbled upon it or knew where you were going. I pull onto this dirt road, driving as slowly as I can, and pull up to a small one-storied house. At the front of this house was a man sitting in his rocking chair, listening to the rain. I get out of my car and he gets up to come help me with the food. At first, he genuinely seemed like a pleasant guy. He looked like your typical redneck, but he was respectful and apologized for the confusion of his location. I had said that it wasn't a problem and to have a nice day. Before I was about to get back in my car, he then asks if I wanted to come inside to try some pastries he had made earlier. I politely decline and tell him I had to get back to doing orders. However, he didn't even seem to acknowledge my response and simply insisted that I go inside with him. Once again, I declined, telling him I was sorry and that I'm sure they were good. No matter how many times I said no, he'd always make attempts for me to agree, even going as far as raising my tip. This time, I was visibly annoyed, but still kept my composure while giving him a firm no. I then take out my phone, pretending I was on a phone call with another customer. This thankfully made him stop asking me, causing him to go inside with his food. When he did, I hop back into my car, start my engine, and sped off. As I'm driving back down this narrow road, I then see him speed walking after my car from my rear view mirror. Now, if the story had ended there, it wouldn't be scary. But this story comes with a very unsettling twist. That night when I had gotten home, my girlfriend and I had sat down on the couch watching the news. At one point, there was a chilling news report about a man in the area attempting to lure kids into his truck. As much as I hate to say it, we lived in an area that wasn't so great, so stuff like this did happen occasionally. But when this news report showed the person responsible, I almost spit out the water I was drinking. On my TV was the same man I had taken the delivery order from, causing me to go absolutely hysterical. He had the same face, same beard, and the same hair. I just knew it was him. Turns out, He was arrested shortly after I had delivered his food. After all, I knew there was something off about that man, and boy did I end up being correct. This happened when I was 19 years old when I was a sophomore in college. My parents had just started making me pay for my things as they felt I was getting too old for them to be paying. This included things such as food, bills, items, and other things like that. While they still took care of the house bills, it was really expensive to pay for all of my stuff. I had a small part-time job at my college, but them paying $10 an hour wasn't enough to keep me satisfied. In other words, I needed to find another job. I lived in a small town in Ohio, so there weren't many openings available. Thankfully, my friend who was an athlete at the time had told me about this new app called DoorDash. He explained that he did well from it and that it was very easy money. With no job and nothing to do, I decided to do delivery until I could find a stable job. For the first few weeks, I got absolutely nothing. I assumed it had been because I was new to DoorDash, and that was why. As time progressed, however, I got assigned to take more orders, which really increased pay. One night, I was home alone, bored out of my mind with nothing to do. Being productive, I decided to do a few orders and possibly make a few bucks for the night. It was around 9 p.m. and I had only gotten done about 5 orders before I was ready to call it a night. However, that was when another delivery option became available and decided to take it. The drive wasn't too far and the person had ordered a lot of food, which meant the possibility of a bigger tip. Long story short, I get the food and drive to the house when I get a phone call from the person who placed the order. He had told me in what seemed like an anxious tone that he had made the mistake by marking the option to leave the order at the door and that he'd preferred it to be handed. He also mentioned that he was alone and just wanted to talk as he needed, quote, human communication. Okay, so this kind of set up a little bit of a red flag as I wasn't sure why it even mattered. Being dumb and not thinking too much into it, I tell him that it was no problem and within minutes I pull up to the driveway. Now, his driveway is a very long stretch of gravel road through a few trees, which made it even more sketchy. The very second I pull in, I see him in front of his garage waving a fire axe around. I felt a chill run down my spine as I saw this and rolled down my window, telling him that if he wanted his food that he'd have to come get it himself. He replies with something along the lines of, No, that's okay. You don't have to be more scared than you already are. I tell him that I'm not getting out of the car and that if he wanted it to come get it. He does not like it when I say that and starts charging at my car with the axe in hand. I immediately hit the gas and drive out of there as fast as I could. Thankfully, he didn't manage to catch up to me or hurt me in any way. I canceled the DoorDash order and called the police explaining everything. I wasn't sure if they took action or not, but either way, I reported the incident to DoorDash and quit right then. Anyway, that's my story, and I hope you can learn from it and to always trust your gut. So, this happened the day before Halloween, and I'm still on the edge of my seat as I write this. For reference, I'm a female, currently 24, and live in a small town outside of Omaha, Nebraska. The town I lived in is known to be very safe with a population of about 5,000 people, meaning bad things don't happen here. It's a nice little community, and it even had its own park and signature restaurants and shops. I've lived in this town my whole life and never once had a reason to feel afraid. However, that would all change in just one night. It was the middle of the night, and I had just come home from a friend's party really tired. Wanting to go to bed, but also really hungry, I decided I'd figure out what I could eat. Now, one thing you have to know about me is that I could never sleep on an empty stomach. With little to no motivation to cook anything, I decided to order a few things from McDonald's via DoorDash. I hardly used it, but it was convenient for times like these when I didn't want to cook anything. Living in the middle of nowhere, I knew it would take a while for a dasher to deliver my food. To kill some time, I started on some homework and watched a few YouTube videos while waiting for my food. About 30 minutes go by and I get a notification from DoorDash letting me know that the dasher was approaching. Relieved, I go outside where I was greeted to a man in his car that had my food. He politely gives it to me and even makes sure it was the correct order and tells me to have a nice night. I thank him for the order and leave him an extra tip as a token of my respect. He then drives off and I go inside to finish my homework while I ate my dinner until it was time for bed. After about an hour or so of rolling around in my bed trying to get comfortable, I finally managed to fall asleep. Suddenly, the sound of heavy knocking at the front door abruptly woke me up. Thinking it was maybe my parents or possibly my older brother coming home, I put on my slippers and go out to the front to look. Standing on the other side of the door was the DoorDash delivery man staring at my Ring doorbell camera with this creepy smile. He was saying all these sorts of weird phrases while pacing back and forth around my patio. I ask him if he needed help, and he responds in this raspy voice saying that he wanted to thank me for the tip and wanted to come in to chat. I tell him that it was my pleasure, but that I couldn't let him in as I was sleeping. However, he disregarded my answer and started persuading me as to why I should let him in. At this point, he's clearly not taking no for an answer, and I told him to please leave my property before I called 911. His joyful, cheerful face then suddenly changed drastically into anger. Then, as if things couldn't get any worse, he starts to form this really creepy grin and begins to laugh out loud hysterically. On top of that, he also made various death threats towards me while basically pounding on my door. Now, I can't show you the whole video, but here's a picture of what he looked like taken from my Ring doorbell camera. That's what I saw, clear as day, standing right outside of my driveway. I tell him that I'm calling the police, and this is what made him finally back off and drive away. Needless to say, I reported the incident to DoorDash and called the sheriff just to be safe. From what I heard, DoorDash had removed him from doing deliveries and police were able to make an arrest. I'm still not sure if I'd be writing this had I opened the door. So, I've been a dasher for DoorDash ever since I came out in 2013. I've basically made a living off it, doing deliveries almost every day and making bank by doing it. While there have been some pretty shady encounters throughout my years of DoorDash, this story takes the cake. My girlfriend and I had just attended a concert and we were on our way back to her house to go drop her off. I drop her off and kiss her goodnight, and with enough time to spare, I decide I'd go do some orders to make some extra cash. Doing deliveries for a while might seem like a hassle, but it's really easy once it starts to grow on you. Within a few minutes, I received an order to go pick up from KFC. However, the problem was that whoever placed the order barely met the delivery radius. I sighed, but said screw it and did the order. Long story short, I pick up the food, put it in the car, and drove the 30-minute drive to the address. My GPS led to the more rural side of town. I hated this part of my city as it's a very sketchy area with the type of people you didn't want to meet. You get the type of place I mean. Long story short, I pull up to the house my GPS took me to, and it's this old rundown looking house that basically looked abandoned. The lights were off, and there wasn't even a car in the driveway. While all of this seemed like one big red flag, I couldn't bail on the order, so I very hesitantly approached the door with the food. I'm about halfway to the door when it surprisingly opens and a woman steps out. She wore what seemed like a nightgown and looked as if she had just gotten out of a shower. I continue walking and attempt to hand her the food when one of her iced teas falls out and spills all over the driveway. The look of sheer anger on her face said it all, and I apologized, telling her I'd pay for it and that I could go back to get her another one. However, this didn't seem to faze her as she began to yell in my face, telling me how I couldn't do my job right, that DoorDash hired lazy people, etc. I simply told her that it was an accident and that I'd be more than happy to replace it. All of a sudden, she went back inside and came out 10 seconds later carrying a pistol. She aims it at me, and I drop the order, get in my car, and just go. Thankfully, I didn't hear any gunfire, which either indicated that she only did it to scare me or that it was a fake gun. I still sometimes DoorDash every now and then, but still got a part-time job to support myself. This just goes to show you that everything you basically do in life is dangerous. When I was 17, I worked at a pizza chain as a part-time job in Iowa City, Iowa. Being a teen with not much in my life, I had mostly worked the night shifts alongside my other coworker. It would stay busy well into the day and would start to die down come evenings. This was around the time where people were simply too tired to come and get food and preferred to just order it. I won't disclose any of my colleagues' information, so I'll just call my coworker Jared. Jared was a bit older than me, who was mainly placed in charge of making the pizzas while I was the one delivering them. On this night, it had just been me and him. It was already past 10 and we were getting ready to close when the phone rang. I answered it and right away I hear someone on the other end, an older lady requesting a large pepperoni. I was annoyed as we were about to close and I really did not feel like driving. She had given me the address, which thankfully wasn't too far, and because it was a single pie, I'd be in and out. Thankfully, Jared had made a pepperoni pizza and couldn't deliver it due to a cancellation, so he just told me to take that one instead. I hop into my car and drive a few miles down near the interstate. Now, this interstate wasn't very popular, and it was also somewhat unsettling. This was mainly due to the fact that it had been surrounded by forest on the opposite sides of it. Driving through these roads at night with nobody around is enough to creep anyone out. After all, I did live in the rural part of my city, which only added to the creepiness. Anyway, I'm driving down the road when I see something up ahead on the side of the grass. As I drive closer, I realize it's a man waving his arms up in the air, attempting to flag me down. Now, I would have just drove by him, but earlier that week, I had heard the phrase, "Character is what you do when no one is looking." And for whatever reason, that was the night I decided that I was a man of character. Huge mistake. I pull over slowly and roll down my window just a tad before asking him if he needed help. Right away, he starts rambling on about how he was taking his dog for a walk when it ran off into the woods. He then offers me $300 if I could help him find his dog, as it was near and dear to him. Almost immediately, alarms start going off in my head as he's telling me his story. 1. Who walks their dog in the middle of an interstate? 2. If he did have a dog, why is he walking it at this time of night? And 3. The forest area is barricaded by wired fences, so there's no way the dog would have just jumped over it. I might have been naive, but I wasn't born yesterday. I apologized, telling him I'd be unable to, as I had to deliver this pizza and that it couldn't be late. However, he disregarded what I had said and basically tried pressuring me into helping him. I tell him no once again. Just as he was about to say something, I hear, clear as day, a blood-curdling scream from the woods calling for help. From my point of view, it sounded like a woman's cry for help. It was then when I had looked at this person who now had this menacing glare. He looks around for a brief second, leans in toward my car, and tells me to leave in a more upset tone. Not giving it a second thought, I speed down the road, not looking back. The rest of my delivery went smoothly, but I still couldn't shake the feeling off of what had happened. I reported my encounter to the police, and I was later told that they had searched the area, but had found no sign of anyone. The next day, I had gone back to my job and quit right then and there. No more late-night deliveries for me. Till this day, I'm still not sure what I encountered that night. I'm not sure if it was someone that really did lose their dog, or something much worse.
My name is Nate, and I was around 15 years old when this happened. My family and I had lived in a small town right outside of Nashville, Tennessee. I attended school at a private institution and was definitely no popular kid. I had a group of friends, but there were only 2 in the group who I really considered as real friends. They've always had my back, and we would even go to each other's houses on Fridays. One night, my parents were out of state for a work event, and being the rebellious kid I was, I had both my friends over for a movie night. It was me, my good friend Ryan, and my other friend Mike, along with my dog Bruce, who we all knew and adored. Bruce was a big German shepherd who had the personality of a teddy bear and was very friendly. When they arrived, our first move was to help ourselves to my dad's stock of booze he kept in his closet. Yeah, we were crazy kids, and if we were to get caught, it would have been worth it. We spent the next few hours playing video games and watching the hit new season of Stranger Things. As we're about halfway into one of the episodes, the 3 of us hear an unexpected knock at the door. The 3 of us looked confused, as we weren't expecting any more visitors. I got up from the couch to go to the door, expecting it to be my parents, possibly returning home early. Standing there on the porch was a Domino's delivery pizza man carrying a single large pie. He gives us a smile and says, "Hey, large pepperoni, paid for online." We all look at each other as we hadn't ordered any pizza. However, the 3 of us are suckers for pizza and we gladly take it off his hands. Being a bunch of teens, we weren't going to give up on a free pizza. However, Ryan, being the good Samaritan he was, had gotten us to agree that we shouldn't just eat someone else's food. In the end, we decided it was the right thing to do, and so we left the pizza on the kitchen table and called the nearest Domino's. We told them that there had been a mistake and that we received an unordered pizza. They ask for my address, and when I tell them, they say that they hadn't gotten any orders from that part of town all day. On top of that, they had also pointed out that my location barely met their delivery radius. We confirmed to them several times that it was indeed a Domino's pizza. They told us they would check around and call us back if they had found anything. And if they found nothing, we could just go ahead and eat it. We give them about 10 minutes to call us back and fix ourselves a few snacks in the meantime. We head back into the kitchen and was shocked by what we found. Bruce had stuffed his face into the pizza box and had eaten nearly half of the pizza. As funny as it was, we knew that we had been in hot water if this really was a mistake. Ryan goes to throw the pizza in the trash, and we finish our show while eating our snacks. About 30 minutes later, I started to notice that Bruce had started to become noticeably distressed. He had been whimpering and crying and would frequently begin losing his balance. After a few minutes of checking to see what was wrong with him, it didn't take long to realize that he was extremely ill. Not wanting to wait any longer, we all carry him and find a nearby emergency vet. We thankfully find one and rush him in there as soon as we could. Because this was later in the night, the vet had taken him home almost immediately to get tested on. According to the vet, he was displaying unusual symptoms and behavior. Upon running a few more tests, they had found something that nearly turned our stomachs. There had been several traces of strychnine found in Bruce's system. It's a very dangerous poison, mainly used for killing rodents. If consumed, this can ultimately kill you in about 30 minutes. It turns out that the cheese on the pizza had been laced with it. My parents had to come home right away when they found out, and we had told the police everything. We even tried describing the guy who had given us the pizza, but nothing came of it. Because he had looked like any ordinary pizza delivery person, there was no way to accurately describe what he looked like. There had been no reports in the area of other people receiving a poisoned pizza. The good news was that Bruce did thankfully survive with proper treatment. However, if we would have waited just 10 minutes later, chances are he wouldn't have made it. If you ever get food deliveries to your house that you never ordered, call the company it was from to confirm. It might just save your life.
When I was 18, I started doing DoorDash as a side hustle to support my family and I. Other than putting a crap ton of miles on your car, it was a pretty chill job to say the least. One night, I was doing deliveries as usual when I got an order from a local food chain not too far. To cut to the chase, I get the food and drop it off at the given address, and this was when shit went down. After dropping the food off, I got a phone call from the person who ordered only to hear heavy breathing. After saying hello several times, I was about to hang up when someone on the other end says, "You'll find a surprise when you get home." They then hung up and I drive over to my apartment to find the door cracked open. In fact, the whole apartment room had been ransacked. Tables turned over, furniture broken, and glass shattered everywhere. This incident still leaves me in shock as it still doesn't make sense. Even today, police were never able to figure out if it actually was the person who ordered. It wasn't long until after where I quit DoorDashing.
I learned a lot and saw a lot when I was working the overnight shift at the Taco Bell in my town. We had one of the Taco Bell locations that would close the interior of the restaurant at around 1 a.m., but the drive-thru would be open all night long. It was a pretty simple job, especially since for the most part, after 2 in the morning you only had to deal with a few customers. And for the most part, the customers were pretty cool. But there was one interaction that I know I'll never forget. That night, there was only myself and one other person working. He was doing a lot of the cooking while I cleaned the restaurant for the morning shift and took in orders on the drive-thru headset. It was probably about 2 in the morning when this customer first came through. He had a fairly simple order, so we got him all set up and he came through the window without any problems. We talked a bit while I waited for his food to be ready, and I remember him asking me how many people we had in there right now. And I didn't think anything of it, so I let him know it was just me and my manager. But by that point, his food was ready and he drove away. No big deal, right? Wrong. 20 minutes after he pulled off, someone else set off our drive-through notice, and I began talking to them through the headset, asking how I could help them today. And right away, I recognized the guy's voice. I was curious as to why he would come back so soon, especially since this time when he placed the order, it was only for another drink. I told him to pull up to the window and I thought everything was going to be fine. But as soon as his car pulled up, I noticed he wasn't alone. He had 2 other people with him, and when they got to the window, the passenger and the person in the backseat began to get out of their car. I got a bad feeling about the situation right away, so I proceeded to close and lock the drive-through window, which is when they began flashing their pistols at the window. And I know the glass isn't bulletproof, so I was going to open the window. It's not worth getting shot over. But as I reached to unlock the window, one of the guys must have thought I was reaching for something and he pulled the trigger 4 times. I didn't even feel it, but I knew I had been hit when I heard the 3 men outside the window panicking before I heard their car tear out of the drive-through lane. I looked down and saw blood beginning to leak through my shirt. I fell to the ground clutching my torso. Everything around me began going black, and the next thing I knew, I was in the hospital, and almost 3 whole days had passed. The police didn't have any luck finding the guys who shot me, and my coworker claimed that they didn't even try to take anything after shooting me. According to the police, the shooter most likely didn't mean to fire his weapon, and when they did, all of the perpetrators panicked and fled the scene as fast as they had arrived. It was the second security job that I had ever had, and at first I was loving it. The job was to work the night shift in an apartment building that was currently in the process of being renovated by new owners. The reason they hired security was to make sure that no one was squatting in any of the empty, run-down apartments. And if I'm being honest, it was really a simple job. My shift typically started around 9 p.m., and I would work with one other security guard. We would take turns walking each of the floors and making sure that all the doors were secure. But other than that, we practically got paid to spend most of our night just hanging out in the lobby and watching the few cameras that were laid out around the building, most of which were focused on the doors leading in and out. For the most part, it was really simple and relaxing, but there was a few incidents that put both me and my coworker Sam on edge. It all started when Sam came back from her walkthrough of floor 5 one night, and she told me that she could have sworn she heard someone walking around the halls, but when she checked, she saw nothing. After that, almost every walkthrough we did, one of us could swear that we heard things, whether it be walking, creaking, or sometimes even the sound of something banging against the wall of a room. Anytime we checked it out, there was no one to be found. We started to joke with one another about the building being haunted, but that was just to lighten the mood after anything creepy happened. It wasn't until about 2 weeks after we started hearing noises that I had confirmation that someone was in the building with us, and it was just my luck that it happened on the one day that month that Sam had taken off of work. I began doing my first walk through the building that day, and as soon as I got into the stairwell, something in the back of my head told me that I wasn't alone. But I figured I was just jittery after all the noises that were happening, and since I had been alone, I was just a little bit more on edge. I made my way through the first, second, and third floors without any incident. However, as soon as I began making my way through the dimly lit hallway of the 4th floor, I began to hear footsteps. I kept looking over my shoulder as it sounded as if the steps were coming from behind me, but every time there was nothing there. I made sure to check every room on the floor thoroughly, and to my surprise, there was still nothing to be found. I tried my best to put the noises in the back of my mind and continued on with my walkthrough. I made it back down to the lobby and began relaxing when I practically fell right out of my chair. I had been looking at the screen on my desk, and I thought I had seen movement out of the corner of my eye near the stairwell. And sure enough, As soon as I looked up, I could see what was clearly an adult male staring at me through the doorway of the staircase. I jumped backward in my seat, knocking myself over, and practically fell right onto the ground. I scrambled to get back to my feet, but by the time I looked back at the stairwell, that man was gone. I took off after him, and I could have sworn that I heard him running up the stairs and then through the door onto the 4th floor. But by the time I had gotten there, the man was nowhere to be found. I called the police, and they did a thorough search of the building but came up empty-handed. Honestly, for a minute I felt like I must have been seeing things, but I know for a fact that there was someone else in the apartment building with me that day. And for the next week or so, Sam and I made sure to run our walkthroughs together so that we always had backup. But to our surprise, there weren't any signs of the man that I had seen, and the strange noises had also seemed to stop, at least for a little while. It was only around 9 days after the first sighting that Sam and I ended up having another incident. The two of us just started our shift, and we were getting ready to do our first walkthrough when all of a sudden, we heard what sounded like someone yelling coming from upstairs. Now, it didn't sound like screams coming from someone in pain, but instead sounded like someone yelling very aggressively. The two of us looked at each other, and then we grabbed our radio and cell phones before going to check it out. Sure enough, the yelling that we heard was coming from the 4th floor, the same floor that I had followed the man onto the first time that I had seen him. Sam and I made sure to be careful as we stepped into the hallway since it was very poorly lit, and we didn't know what to expect. And sure enough, as soon as we walked out of the staircase, the yelling ceased. Sam and I both listened closely in hopes to finding out where the yelling had been coming from. And both of us nearly turned around and ran back down the stairs when the man began yelling at us directly. "You won't take me home," he began to yell. "Neither of you." Sam and I looked at each other before I responded. "Sir, we aren't here to hurt you. Please come out so we can talk." We waited for a moment, but there was no response. There was no verbal response. But Sam tapped me on the shoulder before pointing to one of the rooms on the left of the hallway. We could clearly see the door beginning to crack open before something flew out of it toward us. I heard the sound of something small hitting the wall next to me, and when I looked on the floor, I saw what looked like a small dart of sorts. Sam and I didn't say anything to each other before we both took off running down the staircase. It wasn't long before Sam was on the phone with the police station again, and they had units heading our way. This time, when they got there, I decided to wait in the stairway for them to make sure that the man hadn't had a chance to escape. And Sam was watching the cameras and all of the exits. As far as we knew, the man was still on the 4th floor. The police arrived and they made their way up to the floor and headed straight for the room that we had seen the dart fly out of. This time, the man made no attempt to hide or escape. As soon as the police knocked on the door of the room, he opened it and turned himself in. The police officer that Sam and I spoke to seemed very concerned for our safety and asked us if either of us had ever met this man before. We both said no, and when we asked why, the officer informed us that the man was likely going to lure us both into the room he had been hiding in to kill us. They found multiple knives in the room with him alongside multiple large garbage bags and 3 plastic tarps. That wasn't all though. On this person, the officer said they found a tranquilizer gun along with 3 darts that had been laced with a strong sedative. To this day, we still don't know why we would have been targeted. In the summer of 2002, I found myself working at one of the gas stations in our town, and more often than not, the owner would put me on the night shift, which I was not fond of, but I needed the job, so there wasn't much to argue about at the time. I did put my foot down after an incident occurred that caused us to call the cops and got us slightly involved in a murder investigation. And after that, I was never put on the night shift again. The problem came at around 11 at night when I was the only person working in the store, and I saw a man walking down the sidewalk. It looked like he was going to come in and buy something, but to my surprise, he seemed to stop in the parking lot. I watched the man from the window of the gas station as he appeared to be looking around for something. It's hard to describe it, but his movements looked like he was some sort of walking zombie. He was half hunched over, and with every step he took, it almost looked like his arms were twitching. I thought about checking on him and asking if he needed help, but right before I could bring myself to do something, I noticed something that shook me up a bit. What I originally thought was simply a red pattern on his shirt was now glistening under the streetlights as if it was something that was wet. And the more I looked at it, the more I noticed that his hands and fingers were also covered in this red substance. Right away, I knew something was wrong. And considering that I was alone in the gas station, I decided my best option would be to lock the door. I walked around to the corner and went over to the door to lock it. And just at that moment, the man in the parking lot happened to look over at me. I continued locking the door and bolting the floor lock as the man began to approach the glass. As he got closer, it was clear that he had been covered in blood, some of which was even on his face, but none of it appeared to be coming from him. I reached for my cell phone and began calling the police as the man began to press his face against the glass door. He began slapping his hands against the glass as he yelled in some sort of incoherent language. The police assured me that they were on their way to my location, and I made sure to stand far away from the glass. About 30 seconds before the police arrived, the blood-covered man reached into his pant pocket and pulled out a small pocket knife. My eyes widened as he began to fold open the blade and then press the tip of it against the glass. The man began to let out a sinister laugh, and it looked like he was getting ready to wind up his arm and smash the glass door once and for all. Lucky for me, the police ended up pulling into the parking lot before he could do so. The man turned and faced the two cars that pulled up, and they were immediately at a standoff. Thankfully, the police managed to tase the man before he could hurt anyone and arrest him. But get this, things got even more serious the next day when the police came in to question me about what happened. It turns out before coming to the gas station, the man had taken some sort of drug that made him very belligerent. He then proceeded to murder his girlfriend and her older brother in the apartment before walking down the road. He told the police that he had been possessed by demons and that his god told him that he would find more at the gas station. I don't know what was going through his head. All I know is I've never been so terrified in my entire life.
Almost 20 years ago now, I used to work the overnight shift at an animal shelter. I know that's a long time ago, but something happened one night that is burned into my memory. I can recall the whole thing like it was yesterday. The textures, the smells. It's something I've carried with me for nearly 2 decades. My shifts were from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, a solid 8 hours of sleeplessness that grounded me down over the course of my time there. Night shifts can be good if you need the money, even better if you're antisocial, but the lifestyle grinds you down. Put it this way, I had a full vitamin D deficiency after just 6 months of working there. It's not a healthy way to live. The animal shelter itself was actually a pretty big place. A horseshoe-shaped building complete with a waiting area, a series of offices, medical examination room, and, of course, hundreds and hundreds of kennels and cages. Aside from once a week when the overnight cleaning staff were there, I spent all of my shifts alone behind the shelter's reception desk that gave me a direct line of sight through the security glass of the shelter's front doors. My only duties were to monitor the emergency phone line, check on the animals now and then, and do some basic filing. I'd pack a few snacks and sandwiches for when I got hungry mid-shift, and every so often I'd call up the 24-hour pizza joint just a few miles away and get them to deliver a box of hot, cheesy joy to push me through the night. Sure, the hours sucked, but working at the animal shelter gave me a great deal of freedom, and it paid really well. I mean, way better than any other night porter jobs I'd seen advertised. It was quite a happy time in my life, which I suppose is why I remember this story so well. It was such an odd event in an otherwise joyful time in my life. Anyway, on the rare occasion that someone came in, it was to drop off a stray animal that they had found or one they no longer could care for. The shelter was always happy to take them in and make them as comfortable as possible. It was kinda nice being the first point of contact to a lot of these animals. A lot of them were nervous or scared, and calming them down with treats and petting was more fulfilling than words can describe. I made a lot of furry friends during my employment at the shelter. I should add that the only exception to the shelter's rescue policy applied to fighting dogs or feral cats. As heartbreaking as it is, dogs that have been trained and conditioned to fight other animals are more often than not hopeless cases. Even if they're sweet and well-behaved around humans, if other animals or even small children aren't safe around them, they've no hope of adoption. Most tend to be euthanized, which is something so sad I can't even bring myself to write about it. But even as hard as these cases are, what happened this one particular night was so much worse. It was just past 3 in the morning when I finished a cigarette outside and was returning to my desk. It was one of those quiet fall nights where the silence seems to hang heavy in the air, so I heard the sound of footsteps coming from quite a ways away. There was a woman sprinting full pelt down the sidewalk towards the front entrance of the shelter, banging on the glass and buzzing the intercom over and over as she reached the doors. As I moved to greet her, I noticed that her cheeks glistened with fresh tears. Something terrible was obviously happening. I hurried to unlock the glass door, trying to remain calm as I asked her how I could help. She didn't answer the question at first, which is really unusual. Normally, that's the first thing out of a person's mouth. They've got 1,000 questions about adoption, what shots an animal might need, etc. All she asked was if she could come inside. She didn't have an animal with her, so I was beginning to get a little suspicious as to why she was there. But nevertheless, I'm not one to turn away an upset person, so I invited her inside, gave her some tissues to dry her cheeks, and proceeded to try to get more info out of her. When she calms down, she begins to tell me that she needs to get her cat back. This was a problem since I wasn't authorized to return any interred animals without the proper signatures and paperwork, all of which was in the locked office of one of the resident veterinarians. There was absolutely no way I'd be able to return her animal, especially not in the middle of the night. She'd have to return during regular hours to talk to one of the vets. It's when I tried to explain this to her that things started to go downhill. To my absolute horror, she goes on to explain that she actually came in earlier that day to have her cat put down. She had returned to claim the body in order to give her precious kitty a proper burial. Seriously, those were her exact words. She's still in tears at this point, and she's getting gradually more upset again the more she's talking about her dead cat. I just wanted to get her out of here. She didn't seem it at first, but the more I was around her, the more I gathered that she wasn't exactly all there, if that makes sense. So, like a fool, I took a brief description and went looking for her dead cat. The shelter keeps the bodies of euthanized animals in large blue plastic drums. You know the type. The kind that chemicals are kept in the black plastic lids. These blue drums are in turn kept in a huge walk-in freezer located in the shelter's basement. I gained access to the room in question, opened the freezer, and began to look for whichever barrel had been sealed the previous day. Finding it was the easiest part of the whole process. As I pulled off the black plastic lid, the smell hit me. Even when they're frozen, the animals still gave off this faint, sickly smell of decay. Throw a load of them into the same plastic drum and, well, the stink gets intense. I had to sift through scores of twisted, frozen corpses, laying them down on the cold metal floor of the walk-in and studying them in order to find the one that matched the woman's scant description. Eventually, I did find the cat that seemed to match the description I was given. But there was one thing. The cat was frozen solid and was actually stuck to another dead cat. I tried pulling them apart with my bare hands, but it was no good. I'd need something else for leverage, so I put the frozen mess of bodies on the freezer floor, put one foot on one of the cats, then proceeded to peel them from one another with a horrific snapping sound. I nearly puked when I'd seen what I'd done. A huge portion of the cat's frozen flesh had been torn away and was still stuck to its frozen partner. Keeping hold of one that was the crying woman's, I threw the other back into the plastic drum, found an opaque plastic bag, and returned it to its former owner. She seemed happy enough and actually tried to hug me as she was leaving, but I really didn't feel like it was worth it. The whole thing left a very bad taste in my mouth. I had no idea what she was going to do with that dead cat, even if she did reassure me that she was just going to bury it. Sometimes, even to this day, I wonder whatever happened to that woman. It was pretty quiet at the gas station, and it was around 10:15. There were no customers in the store, and my coworker and I were doing the usual cleaning chores. I was busy cleaning the large glass doors when my coworker said something to me. I turned to respond, and when I turned back to cleaning the glass door, I nearly wet myself as I see a tall man in a sweater wearing a beanie and the object that scared me the most, a black face mask. My mind begins racing as I reach for my keychain to lock the door, but the man was moving too fast and was inside before I could unclip the keys from my pants. The man looked at me, and in my mind I thought he was sizing me up. I readied myself for whatever this guy plans to do. My heart was racing a mile a second, and I almost thought that this was going to be it, that we were about to be robbed. That's when the man pulls his mask down and reveals his face. He asks if we had restrooms, and I gesture him towards the restrooms. As he walks away, he pulls his mask up again as he passes my coworker, who is quickly but quietly coming up to me. We both were shocked at what was going on, but both of us had hoped that this guy meant no harm. 5 minutes later, the guy comes back from the restroom and he quickly leaves the store. After a little while, my heart stopped racing and things calmed down. That's when I made a realization I had seen a man who looked a lot like the masked man walking around the station and peering through the windows at the inside of the station. I don't know if they were the same person or not, but after thinking about it for a bit, I realized the guy may have been thinking about causing trouble, but when he saw my 6'8", 200-pound coworker walking towards him, he decided against it. I have to go back to close the station tonight. I will be carrying extra protective measures on my person, but I am hoping he doesn't return. Or if he does, he doesn't have that mask. Every gas station employee has that fear of a holdup, and last year a station in the same chain I work for in the same city was robbed, so the fear is especially real for me. In 2015, I managed to land my dream job as manager of this really old rustic pub. It was the kind with stained glass windows, ornate bar fixtures, the works. But it was bought up by this big brewery company not long after, and they ended up cleaning house. So within 6 months of getting my dream job, I'd lost it again. I was desperate. I had rent and bills to pay, so I was ready to work just about anywhere, doing just about anything, for any money at all, really. So I ended up getting a job in this 24-hour off license in the middle of town, and it was my job to work the night shift, 8 p.m. until 6 a.m. This place was really busy, too. Had a cash machine inside, sold really expensive bottles of premium booze, and was mostly a cash business. It was the place that pretty much every single person who went out to drink and wanted to carry on drinking when the bars closed would stop off to pick up a few bottles before they got a taxi home. So I'm not messing around when I say we sometimes had like 7,000 pounds in cash on site by the end of the busiest part of the night shift. And well, I say we, I mean me, as I work that shift entirely alone. So it's Sunday morning, about 5 a.m., and it's just before Christmas. The off-license had been extremely busy that night, and we had way more than 7,000 pounds on site. Like it had been Black Friday, which in the UK means that it was the last Friday before Christmas. So all the office parties had been in town, spending it up, and they pretty much all wanted booze to go home with, too. There were queues going out the door at one point. Seriously, it was one of the busiest shifts I've ever worked, including in pubs. So by the time it started to quiet down, I was ready to collapse. I remember just sort of resting my head on the counter at one point, thinking I could have actually fallen asleep right then and there. Then I hear the little beep at the door opening. And although I'd rather have flushed my own head down the toilet than serve another drunk customer at that point, I get ready to serve one more person. I look up, and in front of me is this bloke who seems alarmingly sober. Like almost everyone who walked in during those Saturday night shifts were rotten drunk, eyes all glazed over and bloodshot, slurring their words, but this guy is shockingly lucid, which was dead weird. He also keeps his hands in his jacket pockets the whole time he's talking. But it gets even weirder when he greets me by name. I thought he might have known me, and I just didn't recognize him, so I remain polite and say like, "Yeah, that's me. How do you know that?" Then he once again refers to me by name and follows up by telling me where I live. Again, I'm like, "How do you know that?" Only this time I'm also thinking that this is a plainclothes policeman or something, and I've done something wrong, like accidentally sold a bottle of booze to someone under 18, maybe even failed one of those underage tests the police try on occasion to catch businesses. Then he starts asking after my mom, then refers to her by name, and asks about my sister, again knowing her name too. He asks me if they're still living at such and such address, and gives their exact street address. I then apologize and tell them that I just didn't recognize him, figuring that he was an old family friend or something that I'd forgotten all about, but something about him is creeping me out all the same. He didn't once take his hands out of his jacket pockets, like to the point it was getting sort of odd. People talk with their hands all the time, and this guy's hands were like wedged into those front pockets on his jacket. That's when these other guys walk in, who also seem weirdly sober. They were quiet and deliberate in their movements, just pacing towards the counter and flanking the guy who seemed to know a little too much about me. Then really politely, the guy who seemed to know all about where I lived and where my family live asked me if there's a toilet in the back of the shop. I told him there was, and he tells me to walk back into it, lock the door, and not come out for at least half an hour. And just to make it clear that he's not really asking me, he shows me that he's holding something inside his jacket, something heavy. Only then do I realize what's happening. They proceed to take all the CCTV USB sticks, wreck the monitors, break into the safe, rinse the tills, empty the shelves of all the premium spirits. I mean, they absolutely robbed the place blind. All the while, I was just sat in the toilet, wondering how that guy knew where I lived or where my family lived. As they were leaving, I heard footsteps walking up to the toilet door, and I started shaking hard. Then I hear this voice telling me that I did the right thing, for the sake of my family, that all the stuff that they'd taken was insured, that no one but the insurance companies would lose a penny, and it was them who were the real thieves anyway. I ended up telling the police that I didn't get a good look at the guy's face, and that I wanted to help them, but that I just couldn't. I told them that it all happened really fast and that they must have been professionals because I didn't even get a chance to hit the alarm behind the counter. They must have gotten away with like 10 grand all in all, and they didn't even take half an hour to do it, more like 15 or 20 minutes to be honest. And they'd managed to make sure that the one person capable of identifying them wouldn't say a thing to anyone about it. Like I can't even tell you how frightening it was that they managed to work out where my mom and sister lived. People who put that kind of work into criminality, they really are not to be messed with. And besides, it's just stuff, just material stuff. It's not worth losing your life over, and it's certainly not worth risking your family's safety over. No amount of money compares to your own mom's safety.
I live on a remote, quiet street in a relatively small town. For the sake of my safety and privacy, I will not disclose the town, as I still live there to this day. It was the last day of school before Christmas break, and like any other 9th grader, I was excited to be home and play the new Call of Duty that was coming out that year. A little background here: since I was in the 6th grade, I always walked home. Today was no different. I left school around 2:37 p.m., but this time I had to take a different route home, as my street had construction. I remembered a shortcut from when I was a little kid that I used to take to school when my road or usual route was blocked or closed due to some reason. I started making my way down the side road as I did years before when I noticed a black Ford following me awful close, but doing the speed limit probably to avoid suspicion. I took a few turns to see if this vehicle was following me, and sure enough it was. I eventually made it home, and when I did, I told my parents, who then passed it off as being over-paranoid, and that was that. Fast forward a few days, and it was Christmas Eve. No sign of that car and no further incidents, until 11 p.m. rolled around, and we were settling in for bed. I remember doing my routine when my dog started barking. I yelled and said, "Shut up." I eventually got up and let them out. I want to say 8 minutes passed when I was startled out of bed, a man screaming in pain outside my window. I looked up to see my dad with a shotgun running outside to the dogs. I rushed out of my bed to the window, and just as I got there, I heard my dad yelling at this guy. And then he shot the back of the guy's black Ford speeding down our road. A police report has been filed, and it's been 4 years since the incident, and I'm now finishing school and looking at colleges. The police never found him, and I still sleep with my dogs by my bed, so the man who tried to ruin my Christmas doesn't come back.
Christmas Eve with my 6-year-old son was one of the most memorable nights of my entire life. Sure, we'd had a bunch of Christmases before that, but being a 6-year-old marked the first time that he really started to understand the whole Santa thing. He became completely fascinated with the idea that this fat dude could just shapeshift down the chimney, not to mention how he could visit every single child on the planet over the course of one night. He started begging me and his mom to take him to Santa's grotto so he could meet the man himself, and when it came to leaving out cookies and milk, he insisted on leaving out an entire package of Pepperidge Farm, believing the more cookies we gave Santa, the better his presents would be. It was absolutely adorable, and it totally rekindled any of the festive spirit me and his mom had lost over the years. So, on Christmas Eve, we leave out the whole bag of cookies, top up Santa's glass of milk, and then I take him upstairs to bed. He's way excited about the possibility of Santa arriving, which poses something of a problem for me and his mom. If he was still awake when we started putting presents under the tree, he might come downstairs, see us eating the cookies and arranging all the boxes, then his festive fantasy would be totally ruined in my mind. We agreed that was totally unacceptable, so we waited until 1 a.m. when he was completely out for the count, before we dressed the scene like Santa had visited, even including a little note thanking our son for all the cookies, saying he was the most generous little boy he'd ever had the pleasure of delivering to. We were so stoked to see his reaction in the morning, so much so that even we had trouble sleeping that night. But just like our son, the adrenaline subsided eventually and we both drifted off to sleep. The next thing I remember, my son is standing by my bed, shaking me awake and whispering, "Dad, wake up, wake up." I can see the little glow in the dark hands of the clock on my bedside table, and they're telling me it's just before 5 a.m. So as much as it was obscenely early in my mind, I knew I had to get up if I wanted to see his face when he opened his presents. All this is going through my head, and I'm just about getting ready to slip out from under the warmth of the covers when my son says, Dad, Santa's downstairs." My first move is to look over to my wife's side of the bed, but instead of being downstairs like I thought she might be, she's lying there asleep next to me. I'm instantly struck by this uh-oh moment, thinking that if my son had just heard someone downstairs, actually heard someone, it obviously sure wasn't Santa Claus. I remember telling my son to wait where he was as I crept towards the doorway, listening out for any sounds coming from downstairs. Believe it or not, it wasn't just his imagination. He was right. I could hear someone downstairs. By this time, his mom had woken up and she's asking what time it is, but all it took was one look from me as I reached for the little lockbox I kept my gun in, and she just knew something was wrong. She was just amazing about the whole thing too, just totally affirmed why I wanted to have children with her in the first place. She just started come to Mama. Come get a Christmas cuddle. And all this other stuff just completely distracting our son despite him insisting he wanted to go meet Santa. I closed the door behind me, crept towards the staircase, then felt my heart pounding as I started to descend. As soon as I saw the two people crouched down by our tree, I raised my pistol and just growled, "Get out of my house!" As soon as they heard me, they just bolted back out the window they'd pried open to get the presents under our tree. I thank God they didn't put up any resistance, that they didn't even say anything before they just jumped out the window. I know of many other confrontations like that where the homeowner came out way worse, and I thank God every single day that I didn't end up as one of them. To me and my partner, it was nothing short of a miracle that the only casualty of that morning was our son's hurt feelings. He was furious that I hadn't let him meet Santa Claus, and no matter how much we tried to explain that Santa was busy and that he couldn't stop to talk, our son cried and cried, all up until we showed him the special note that Santa wrote for him. And that really did the trick, especially once I improvised the idea that Santa had written the note because he was so grateful, even though he was super busy. Now, me and my partner are still wondering how we're going to tell him about that once he's older. We know it'll be something we'll be able to smile about. I mean, no one got hurt, thank God, and I know it'll be funny to see his reaction to the truth, but in that moment, it was just about one of the most terrifying occurrences of my entire life.
This took place in 2014 when I was 15 years old, and it's probably the most terrifying thing that I've ever encountered. Let me explain. My family and I live in Atlanta, and we'd occasionally drive up north to visit our extended family in upstate Virginia. It is a very long and boring trip there, but it was worth it as we had only gone to see them once a year and we would be staying for a few nights. This year, they had invited us to stay for Christmas as we had never celebrated it with them before and figured it would be a nice day. To cut to the chase, we get there around dinner time on Christmas Eve and everyone was just about done setting the table for us to eat. After we all ate, my uncle proposed to us kids that we go play manhunt out in the backwoods as long as it wasn't snowing too hard. For those of you who don't know what manhunt is, it's basically like hide and seek flashlight tag. Everybody is divided into two teams. One team is the hunters, while the other team were the runners, and whoever the last person standing was got a small prize. Each of us were equipped with a flashlight while my uncle kept a close eye on us. In this case, I was on the runners team, and my uncle had given my team a good minute to pick a hiding spot. I chose to hide behind an old barrel that was thrown into the woods years ago. Even though it was a little ways into the woods, it was still a great hiding spot. Eventually, my uncle had blown the whistle announcing that the opposing team was coming to find us. I ever so quickly ducked behind this large barrel about a good 25 feet away from the house. After about 5 minutes of hiding, I then began to see that the other team kept on getting closer and closer to my hiding spot, which meant that I had to move quick. I quietly walked into the woods where I was sure they couldn't see me, when I saw the dim glow of an orangish light about 20 or so feet into the woods. At first, I thought that it could have been one of the hunters, but this light wasn't as bright as a normal flashlight and the other team wasn't in the direction of this light. Being the curious kid I was, I started making my way over to it, wondering as to what it could be. My initial thought was that it was a lantern of some type, but I didn't understand as to why there would be a lantern this far out into the woods. Once I got about 10 feet away from it, right then and there it randomly shut off, allowing me to see nothing but darkness and the light snowfall. I then thought to myself that maybe I didn't need to see what that light was. Suddenly, I begin to hear heavy footsteps in the snow approach me fast from behind. With it being dark outside and still snowing, I couldn't see anyone, so I assumed it was one of the hunters. I ran as fast as I could, a bit more closer to the house where I saw everyone crowded around, including my teammates. I had asked them what was wrong, and all I remember was my dad and uncle telling me to go back inside. When we did, my mom came to tell me and my cousins that there had been a police officer that came up to the door and informed them about a few locals who reported a serial rapist in the area. My blood ran cold as she told us this, and I immediately explained what had happened to me in the woods. Needless to say, we called the police back and they have a team out searching in the backwoods. However, they never did end up finding whoever chased me in those woods, and we never found out what that light was. I haven't been back up there since, and neither have my parents, and we don't plan on ever going back up there anytime soon.
This story takes place on one of the best nights for kids around America, but one of the worst nights for me. It was Christmas Eve of 2019. For a little backstory, 3 or 4 months before this event took place, I broke up with my girlfriend. The event that caused me to break up with her was she stole over $900 from me. I called her and all she said was, before she left, "This isn't over." Fast forward 3 months to Christmas Eve. Since we live in Texas and have a house in the hills, every year on Christmas my family usually goes there to celebrate Christmas. However, this year, I couldn't make it because I had to work. This year I was 17 years old and just got a job by a local supermarket and had to work all Christmas Day. I had no problem being home alone. On Christmas Eve night, it was getting late, probably 11 o'clock or so. I decided to take a shower and go to bed as I needed to get up early for the next day. As I started to shower, I heard a strange noise coming from the garage, sort of like a metallic banging or something dropping. I thought it was some form of a heater because I put the water as hot as I could. I took my shower. When I finished my shower, I went to go to bed, and as I did, I heard the noise again. Although this time, it was on the other side of the yard. I was confused because I didn't think there was anything over there. I went to go look outside the window and see. I looked out and didn't see anything but my backyard, completely empty. I completely disregarded it because my backyard is pretty flat and empty, and it has nowhere for someone to hide. Now it's hard to explain, but my window was fairly large, and it has a blind spot to the left where there's a corner where someone could easily hide, but I was tired and didn't think about it. As I walked off, I heard a bang, but this time it was on my window of my house. And as I looked out the window, I saw the figure of a person dressed in all black standing at my window. It made me jump, however, I wasn't too scared as I am fairly a large dude and a high school football player. This all changed when he reached for his pocket for what I assumed was a gun. I ran away from the window toward my parents' room to go retrieve my dad's shotgun. I knew he kept it in the safe and had the safe key under his pillow. As I was running to retrieve this, I dialed 911. As soon as the dispatcher answered, I heard the horrific sound of the glass shattering. I made it to my parents' room and I shut the door quietly. I whispered into the phone what was happening to the dispatcher. She said to stay on the line as the county sheriff was en route, but it would take about 5 minutes or so. I told her I was going to retrieve the shotgun. She said that's not a bad idea, but only use it if I had to, with caution. I quickly realized my dad took the gun with him because they were going to the gun range. I informed the dispatcher that the gun was gone. She said to make sure to stay on the line. For a moment, everything was silent, and I thought that it may have been a burglar, and they got spooked when they realized someone was home. My heart sank into my chest when I heard not one, but 2 sets of boots walking up the stairs. I heard a heavy metal pole scraping the floor. I locked and barricaded the door to my parents' room. Then I almost passed out when I heard one of them talk. Not in any voice, but my ex-girlfriend's voice. She said, "Merry Christmas, Tommy." And I heard a male voice mockingly say, "We know you're in there." And he knocked on the door of my parents' room. I almost screamed and got underneath the bed. My ex then said, "Don't worry if you can't open the door. We'll open it for you." I heard the pole hit the door and the lock falling out of the door to the floor. I had to put my hand over my mouth to keep from being too loud. All of a sudden, I heard police sirens and my ex muttering, "Oh shit." They ran down the stairs to run out the front door when the officer said, "Freeze." I heard a bunch of yelling, and then an officer came in and said, "If you're in there, make yourself known." I called out to him saying I was Tommy, and I called 911. He told me to come out slowly with my hands visible. As I left my parents' room, I saw the two being escorted out in handcuffs. The rest of my night consisted of paperwork and me talking to my parents who were making a 3-hour drive to come home. This incident was very disturbing to me, and I'm grateful that I reacted the way that I did. Had I not, I might be dead right now.
When I was 7 years old, my parents offered me a very unusual Christmas present. We were moving into a new house across the country, right around the holidays, and I remember my parents sitting me down and basically asking, if you could choose any other name in the world to call yourself, what would it be? I thought about it for a second, then decided that the coolest first name I'd ever heard was Dexter. No, not because of the fictional serial killer, more because of the old Cartoon Network show called Dexter's Lab, which centered around the coolest kid scientist in the history of TV. Mom and Dad asked me to really think about it, because I was going to have to use my new name forever and ever. But my heart was set on Dexter's, so that was that. From then on, my parents referred to me only as Dexter, and not by my old name, which was Anthony. It made for an easy transition, and since we were in a new place, people didn't know us by anything else, and it just so happened that our family had a second name too. That would have all been much harder back in Providence, but I was still kind of curious as to why we'd moved and changed our names. It's like a Christmas present to ourselves, my mom said. New beginnings can be a gift. And I suppose she was right. I was much happier in our new home, and soon the weirdest Christmas ever was just a speck in the rearview mirror, so to speak. It all started in such a weird way, too. Something I didn't understand at all until many years later. I remember getting off the school bus and walking the short distance back to my house when, all of a sudden, I heard a voice calling out to me from a parked car. They were like, Hey kid, you're Tommy's kid, right?" I just nodded. My dad had a lot of friends who all drove fancy cars, so I figured this was another one of his buddies. "What? You don't recognize me now?" the guy asked me. "It's me, your Uncle Johnny. I was at your communion." I just stared at him nervously, wanting to get inside to get warm, but knowing it would be rude to just walk away. Okay, you're still young, but look, I need you to do me a little favor," the guy continued. "I got a Christmas present for your pops here. Make sure he gets it." The guy then produced what looked like a shoebox. Pretty expensive looking thing too. I remember wanting to open it to see what was inside, but the guy was quick to cut me off, telling me not to look inside, that it was a surprise for my father. "You don't want to ruin the surprise, do you?" the guy asked, and I responded by shaking my head. "There's a good kid. Now run along and make sure you give it to your father. And remember, no peeking, okay?" I was considerably less nervous by that point. I mean, if he had a present for my dad, he had to be a good guy. So I just did as I was told. Took the box into the house, then waited for my dad to get home from work. When he arrived home, I rushed to give him the shoebox. I remember it feeling like it was sort of a gift from me, too. Like if I was delivering it, I was sharing in some of that joy. But when I walked up to him and offered him the box, saying it was from Uncle Johnny, he just said, "Who?" I repeated that it was from an Uncle Johnny, and Dad still had that puzzled look on his face as he took the box from me, took off the lid, and rustled around the papers inside to see what it contained. Then suddenly, he froze. and I remember watching the color drain from his face like it was yesterday. He slammed the lid back on the box, and when I asked what was in there, Dad just told me to go up to my room. Then as I was walking up the stairs, he started calling out for my mom. And that's how this weird Christmas started. The next morning, Mom and Dad were piling suitcases into our car while telling me and my sister that we were going to spend the holidays in the countryside because the snow would be better. The next thing I know, we're in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, and I'm getting the very unusual Christmas present of getting to pick a new name. The thing is, at that age, it all just seemed totally normal. Or rather, I know something was happening, I just thought it was something that every family did. After a while, we moved into this new house in another state, and this meant that for the longest time, I thought Colorado and Rhode Island were like right next door to each other. It didn't even occur to me that we'd moved far away from home because I couldn't think of a reason why we'd moved so far. I remember asking my parents if we're going to change our names the next Christmas, and they told me no, because it'd be hard for all the people in our new town to learn new names, so we'd just be keeping the ones we had. I know it seems crazy, but being so young, I just kind of forgot about the whole thing after a while. Again, I thought it was something every family did at some point, just move towns and pick new names. I thought it was part of the process or something. It didn't make a difference with our parents. Me and my sister just called them the same thing we did before the move, Mom and Dad. I had a little trouble getting the hang of my sister's new name, and I know this is becoming a running theme here, but kids can get used to anything pretty quickly. Then, that was that. For like 11 years. My parents basically covered up what happened to the point where I didn't suspect a thing. I think maybe my sister did, but I definitely didn't. She ended up getting the talk before she moved away to college, and then she was part of this conspiracy too, in cahoots with our parents to keep me in the dark for another 3 years. And then, right when I was picking colleges come SAT time, they sat me down for the talk too. Some of you might have guessed what the talk consisted of by now, and no, it wasn't the birds and bees talk if that's what you're thinking. The talk was basically my parents explaining to me that the reason we'd moved out to Colorado all those years ago was because my dad was in the witness protection program. He'd never actually been in the mafia himself. He was just an associate, but things went wrong for him in a big, bad way, and he was dealing with guys who didn't just cut off business ties. They cut off heads and hands so the cops can't identify you. At least, not right away. But anyway, according to them, the mob guys he was working with had two problems. Firstly, they were convinced someone in their organization was a police informant, and secondly, they had no idea who that person might be. So, in order to flush out the informant, they basically set out a bunch of packages to each of them, all containing something that might scare them into making a move. Apparently, my dad wasn't the informant, but he also had no idea that this was part of a larger scheme to flush the mole out. He thought it was a straight-up accusation and decided to get us out of Providence before any punishments could be meted out. So, ironically, the mafia had turned a solid earner into an FBI informant, all by just accusing the wrong person. Now, I don't know if that's 100% true or not. When your parents lie to you for almost your entire life, you wouldn't put another couple past them, but it's the version I chose to believe. But what I know for certain is what was in that shoebox I gave to my dad. It was a rat, and someone had hammered a nail through its mouth. I've worked as a mall Santa for the past few Christmases now. I'm only 33, but thanks to my complete lack of exercise routine, I definitely have the figure for it. And once I have the beard and the wig and hat combo going, there's basically no telling the difference between me and a 60-year-old dude. Mall Santa work can be tough for a few different reasons. Number one, the hours are really long and the pay can be really terrible depending on which mall you manage to get employed by. Number two, the kids can be little monsters. and their parents can be just as terrible on occasion too. But the reason I'm actually considering skipping the entire thing this year and having something of a budget Christmas is that you get some seriously disturbing things happening from time to time. I mean, the kind of things that keep you up at night, even after a long, exhausting shift. However, the worst thing that's ever happened to me as a mall Santa was actually nothing to do with kids, parents, or terrible pay and hours, and I'm sure you'll see why after I tell the story. So every year, usually when the malls are quietest during weekday mornings, we get specially organized visits from special needs kids or adults with learning disabilities who are bussed in from the surrounding areas. Pretty much every other mall Santa I've spoken to about this agrees that it can be one of the most rewarding parts of the job, and that the adults with learning difficulties are often even more excited about the prospect of meeting Santa than some of the kids are. Literally, the only downside is that some of them are so heavy that my thighs hurt after having like 50 in a row sit on my lap, but other than that, it's honestly one of the best parts of the job. Last year, I'm in the middle of one of the special sessions when I get this girl coming up and sitting on my lap. I say girl, but she was legitimately a grown woman, looking like she was in her mid-30s or something, but she had the mental age of about 9 or 10, all smiles and giggles, way shy about meeting Santa again. It was cute as all get out, but the interaction was not so cute, and turned that way pretty fast. So like I said, she's all giggles and smiles as she comes up to sit on my lap, and I give her the usual spiel, asking her name, how old she is, if she's excited for Christmas and all that stuff. Then, when it comes to asking her what she wants me to bring her on Christmas Eve, she starts thinking about it, smiling at first before she suddenly gets super serious with a touch of sadness. I'm asking her if she's okay, what the problem is, and she's like shaking her head, acting like she doesn't want to tell me anything. I take the time and explaining that no matter what she asks for, I'll try my very, very best to bring it to her, no matter how big or small it is, that Santa always tries his best to bring good little girls and boys what they ask for on Christmas. She takes a moment. Then the exchange goes a little something like this. You mean it, Santa? You can get me anything I want for Christmas? Anything. Anything you want. Just tell me and I'll do my best. Okay, well. And at this point she lowers her voice to a whisper and leans into my ear. I want my boyfriend to stop hitting me. Can you make that happen? I was sort of dumbstruck for a second. Like all of the things I thought she was going to ask, that would most definitely not have topped the list. I remember just nodding at first, trying to find the words, then being like, I'll make that happen for you, sure, no problem. She was so happy to hear that I'd fix it for her, and gave me the biggest hug I think I'd ever received while working as a mall Santa. I had to put on a huge smile, and of all the times I've had to fake being jolly and merry, that time with her was the hardest. But I just felt numb, like completely broken by what I'd heard, and I just tried my best to get through the rest of the session without bursting into tears. I remember all these thoughts rushing through my head, terrifying ideas of institutional abuse. She said boyfriend, and that made it extra creepy. Like, sure, it could have been just another guy in her care group or something, another adult with learning difficulties who she'd hooked up with somehow, but there was nothing to say that it wasn't a member of her care team that was, like, abusing her, in a completely different sense, too. Not just physically, but, well, you catch my drift. So when the session was over, I approached the member of the care team that had organized the trip and had accompanied them to the mall. I didn't let anything slip. I just told them how great I thought the session had gone and asked a few details about the group that had organized them. As it turned out, they were all from the same care home type thing, so I made a note of the name of the place as well as the name of the girl that was apparently being abused. That night, I couldn't sleep. I just kept picturing some evil monster abusing that poor girl, taking advantage of their position to put some poor special needs woman through torture, then telling her that she'd be killed if she ever breathed a word of it to anyone. And here's where stuff starts getting even more intense. Now, I could have just called 911 with the info I had at hand, registered a general complaint, and then heard nothing back about it. But a buddy of mine had a cousin with the local police department, and not just some gumshoe beat cop either. They were a detective. It took some convincing, but I convinced my buddy to pass along their cell phone numbers so I could get in touch with the dude personally. It took a little while, but I managed to get through to the guy. He sounded pretty skeptical at first and seemed kind of irritated that his cousin had even given me his number, but once I explained what the issue was, his tone changed completely. Now, I didn't find this out until way later from my friend, but his cousin had a special needs daughter who was probably going to have to either live with them for the rest of their life or was going to head into a group home at some point so she could have some measure of independence. So when I explained the situation with the special needs girl I met as a mall Santa, it obviously hit the guy right in the feels as the topic was so close to home. The detective tells me that he'll look into it, thanks me for letting him know. I get him to promise to tell me if anything comes of it, and he says yes, and we hang up. And that was the last I heard of it for like a month. Then after maybe 5 or 6 weeks, I'd almost forgotten about the whole thing. Christmas was over, the mall Santa job was way behind me, and I was back to working my regular hours as a self-employed mechanic. Then I get a call from a number that seems vaguely familiar, although I wasn't quite sure why. Turns out it was my buddy's detective cousin, who reminded me of the tip that I'd given him about the care company. Of course I remembered, but by that time I really didn't think anything would come of it, but oh, how wrong I was. The detective thanks me for the information, and although he told me he couldn't say too much, he told me to keep an eye out on local media outlets. The next thing I know, it's all over the local papers that there's been a misconduct scandal involving a local care company. I picked up a copy and read the story, only to find out that it's the very same one I had reported. The long and short of it is that the cops had uncovered endemic levels of abuse in the company, stuff that varied from financial discrepancies to straight-up physical abuse, and sickeningly enough, there was even cases of care workers taking advantage of mentally disabled females in ways that were seriously inappropriate. There were numerous arrests, with some of the sleazier and violent criminals looking like they were going to get years in prison for how long they so cruelly taken advantage of some of the most vulnerable people in society. It made me sick to my stomach to read about how some people could bring themselves to do something like that, but it was stopped, and I felt incredible that I'd actually managed to be a part of the chain of events that brought the whole thing crashing down. I just hoped that that poor girl, who was obviously pretty traumatized by what was happening to her, and just not being able to understand why it was happening either, found some measure of peace after it. And in a way, Santa did kind of bring her exactly what she wanted, even if it wasn't on Christmas Day, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is a thought that never fails to make me tear up.
I used to work at my dad's restaurant when I was in my later teen years. It was just a regular local place, but was open until 2 a.m. every night. During high school, I would only work after school until 8, but once I graduated, I started working the closing shifts to save up money for college. The restaurant would be surprisingly busy at night, all the way up until closing. Mostly it was just people picking up online orders, but sometimes groups of friends would come in and hang out at one of the tables while they ate. I definitely preferred working at night though, as I would be the only one there and didn't have to listen to my dad bossing me around. Anyways, after 6 months of working nights, things started to get pretty weird. It was almost closing, around 1:45 a.m., and I was in the back cleaning when I heard the door ring. I finished up what I was doing and made my way to the front counter. There were 2 young men who looked really tired. One of them came up to the counter while the other one stood at one of the tables. "Our dining room is closed for the night, but I can still take a small order if you want it for takeout." The man at the counter just stared at the menu and didn't say anything. I stood there uncomfortably as the man shifted his gaze to behind me, as if he was inspecting the place. A few seconds later, the man by the table quickly walked out and the other guy followed. It was definitely the weirdest encounter I'd probably had, and I couldn't really think of any reasonable explanation. I kind of just assumed that they were planning on robbing me, but then decided otherwise for some reason. The next morning I told my dad about it, and he said I could start locking the doors at around 1:45 for the next few days. Another week went by with nothing unusual before it happened again. I had a customer picking up an order around 1:30, and almost as soon as he left, one of the men from last week walked in. It was the one that was standing at the table, and I noticed right away that he was wearing the same exact clothing as last time. However, this time he came up to the counter. He looked me in the eyes for a second, and then asked me if I could help him jump-start his car. The way he said it was really creepy, and it was very obvious that there was something else going on here. Sorry, I have to stay in the restaurant during my shift. His face immediately shifted into a frown. He said it would only take a minute and no one would know that I left. At this point, I knew something was very off, and I started to panic a little bit in my head. He started making his way back to the door, gesturing me to follow him. I honestly wasn't sure what to do, and was really freaking out, but my fight response was starting, and my adrenaline was pumping. It's worth mentioning that I'm not really that big of a guy at all, and this man was much larger than me. Plus, I was pretty confident that the other guy was nearby too, probably ready to jump me if I didn't comply. But I figured I was screwed either way, so I might as well try to fight. I grabbed a pair of scissors we had behind the counter and stood my ground. The man turned around again once he reached the door, and this time he looked angry and demanded that I followed him. At that same instant, a loud bang came from behind me, followed by the back door slamming open. I ran to the back, and as soon as the guy saw me, he bolted right back outside. I turned around quickly and ran back to the front counter, but the other guy had left as well. I obviously called the police afterwards and gave them the security footage, but it was pretty low quality and hard to make out any identity from them. Anyways, I'm still not really sure why they didn't just attack me and rob the place, but my best guess is that they were just trying to rob the store without harming anyone, so as soon as they saw I was gonna fight, they ran. Those two could have easily taken me down and made the situation much worse, so I'm glad it didn't turn out that way. I work as a cybersecurity analyst for a large office company in my town. I had just started off my first job in the field, so of course I had to work the shift that nobody else wanted to. Working overnight wasn't as terrible as I thought, though. It was actually pretty peaceful. My job mainly consisted of looking through log files to make sure nothing sketchy happened while the rest of the crew was sleeping. This meant that I was always pretty much alone in the office building for several hours. I'd fall asleep pretty often, as staring at a screen for hours on end in the middle of the night was hard on my eyes, and with nobody there to keep me company, staying awake wasn't very easy. I started setting soft alarms on my phone to go off every hour, just to make sure that I didn't sleep through my entire shift. I had been working this job for about 4 months when this happened, and I actually still work there now. It was a regular night, and my coworker had just finished his shift at 12 o'clock and left the building. A couple minutes later, I got up and started the coffee machine, and then I walked down the main hallway to do a general check for anyone still in the building. This was my regular routine, just to make myself more comfortable. I sat back down at my desk and took my phone out to turn on the alarms, and then continued on with my work. It was about 20 minutes later when I realized I had never heard the coffee machine beep that it was done, and I went to check on it. I walked down the hall to the small coffee desk and saw that there was no coffee in the pot, and then I saw that the entire coffee machine was turned off. I thought it was weird, but that's about it, and I just turned it back on and went back to my desk. As soon as I sat down, I noticed my phone wasn't where I had left it on the desk. I patted down my pockets and ran back to the coffee desk, but it wasn't there either. I played it back in my memory, and I knew for sure that I had placed it right on my desk right next to my keyboard. I started to get really freaked out and looked around frantically.
The way my desk was set up, it was right in the middle of a large room with other desks and computers. I felt like I was being watched as I stood there in the middle, knowing that someone else had to be in there with me. Nervously, I called out in a shaky voice to my friend, really hoping that it was just him playing some dumb prank on me. I waited for a few seconds, but there was no reply. As I stood by my desk, another few seconds went by before I heard a soft shuffling coming from behind a desk in the far corner. Almost immediately after, my phone alarm rang from the opposite corner of the room. My first thought was that there were probably two unknown strangers in the room with me, and I instantly started running for the door out of the building. I didn't hear any footsteps behind me as I made it out, but I didn't take any chances. I ran across the street to a neighboring gas station, and I called 911 with their phone to report the unknown people in our office building. The police arrived quicker than I thought and searched the building. They brought out a man after only a few minutes, though I didn't recognize him at all. They also retrieved my phone, which they found behind some boxes in the corner of the office. He was also found with a small knife in his pocket. The next day, we got a lot more information about what really took place. Apparently, the man was an old employee who had been fired recently before I started working there. The man told the police he was trying to scare me in order to get me to leave the building so that he could take back his company laptop. Apparently, he had information that he wanted from it. At least, those were his claims. It all seems really weird to me, and I'm not sure if I even trusted his reasonings to breaking in, but my coworkers did say that they remembered the guy, and he was definitely a little bit strange. I'm glad I got out of there when I did, though, because I'm not sure what would have happened if his plan didn't work, and I chose to stay in the building. I lived in a small apartment for most of my 20s, as it was all that I could afford since I lived alone. My complex was small and only had 6 total apartments in it. Most of the people living there were older and retired, and kept to themselves. I actually liked the fact that I didn't have to interact with any of them every time that I needed to go in or out of the complex, as I'm usually in a rush or just not in the mood to socialize. Anyways, I lived on the top floor, and the room across from me had an old couple living there for almost 2 years before they moved out. I never talked to them, so I didn't really care, to be honest. But several months go by before someone new moves in, and another 2 weeks went by before I actually met them. I was getting ready for work one morning and preparing my packed lunch when I hear the neighbor's door open. I didn't think much of it until another minute went by, and I realized that I never heard the door close. I finished getting ready and put my shoes on, then opened my door to leave. I immediately noticed that the neighbor's door was still open, and a tall man in his 40s or 50s was standing right outside the door facing me. He smiled and introduced himself. I faked a short smile and told him my name, then said I had to go to work and began walking past him. But as I started down the stairs, he asked me to come in for a little bit and have breakfast with him. This was really weird, as I had just told him that I needed to go to work. But I just said sorry and continued down the stairs and out of the complex. While I was at work that day, I thought about how strange the interaction was. Thankfully, when I got back home, I was able to get into my apartment without any interactions. But the next morning, I woke up to a knock at the front door. I was really annoyed because I had work today, and now I was up early, but I quickly got dressed and opened the front door. My neighbor was there, but strangely, he was standing right in front of his open door again. He asked me to join him for breakfast again, to which I obviously declined, and told him in a more aggressive manner to not knock on my door so early. The man didn't seem very happy about my answer, and just kinda stood there. Then he said that I didn't have to leave for work for a while, and I had enough time to eat with him. I knew that there was something wrong with this guy, as there was a lot about that response that was creepy. I firmly said no and then backed away and closed my door, making sure to lock it. Again, the more I thought about this guy, the more creepy and disturbing the interactions seemed. The rest of the day went by as usual though, and I got home around 6. I made some dinner and watched a movie, then got ready for bed around 11. I laid in bed for a while, thinking about my creepy neighbor and wondering what to do about it. I decided that if anything else happens, I'd contact the owner of the complex and have him talk to the guy. Then I leaned over and turned off my lamp and tried to fall asleep. But a few minutes later, I heard the neighbor's door creak open. I waited silently, listening to what the guy was doing, but I couldn't hear anything else. Again though, I never heard the door close. I was pretty nervous, unsure of what the man could possibly be doing this late at night. Eventually though, I drifted asleep due to not hearing any further noises for over an hour. I'm not sure how long I slept before a loud knock at the door woke me up. But these knocks didn't come from my front door. They were at my bedroom door. I shot up, completely terrified, and turned on the lights. The only thing I had to defend myself with was a small screwdriver on my nightstand. I grabbed it and stood next to my bed, shaking in fear, before picking up my phone and calling 911. When they arrived at the front door, I quickly got out of my room and opened it. I was surprised the door was even shut, but I told the officers everything and all about my suspicions of the neighbor. Unfortunately though, there was no real evidence of a break-in, and they couldn't do much at all. I knew what I heard was real though, and I did not feel safe in my apartment anymore. I called my sister later that day, and she agreed to let me stay at her place for a few days. Those days went by quicker than I hoped though, and I started driving back to my apartment on Saturday evening. I tried to stay calm, assuring myself that the guy had given up by now, and everything would be okay. I pulled into the parking lot and made my way into the building. The sun had just set, so the staircase was dim. I slowly made my way up, trying to stay quiet as to not let my neighbor know that I was coming up. Once I reached the top, I saw his door was closed and I got a big sense of relief as I quickly made my way through my door and locked it behind me. I dropped my bag in the hallway and turned on the lights as I turned the corner into my living room. I jumped back screaming as the man was sitting right on my couch staring at me with a wide, awful smile. I sprinted out of the entire complex and into my car, then called the police again and waited for them in a nearby parking lot. When they arrived about 10 minutes later, we drove up to the complex and they went into the apartment while I waited by my car. Surprisingly, they came out just a minute later with the man in handcuffs. They said he was still sitting on the couch and that they also found a small knife in his pocket. The most disturbing part of this whole situation, though, was that when he was questioned, he admitted to breaking in 3 separate times, and I only knew about the 2 incidents, which meant that at one point he was hiding in my apartment, probably watching me without me even knowing. I have a little Jack Russell dog named Maggie, and she has a lot of energy, so when we go for walks, it's not uncommon for them to spread to the 2-hour mark. This particular day, I got home from work around 5:30, and the sun doesn't usually set until 6:30 or 7. Almost immediately after walking through the door, I put her leash on and quickly changed, and then we headed out. The walk went as usual, as Maggie just took me in whichever direction she wanted to walk in. Things didn't start to take a turn until about an hour in, when the sun was almost fully down, and unfortunately for me, I had walked further than I'd realized. If you take your dog for long walks, you know how easy it is to zone out, especially if your dog rarely stops to sniff. We had walked in a direction I had taken normally, but the particular street I was on was unfamiliar, but I still knew the general direction home. I started to turn around, but Maggie was standing still, and then she began whimpering softly, and that's when I saw it. Through the soft light of the sunset, I could make out a huge coyote staring at us in the middle of the street. It was roughly the size of a golden retriever, with matted fur, and with its mouth partially opened, you could see its disgusting sharp yellow teeth. I knew exactly what it wanted. I picked Maggie up and started walking the opposite direction. I was a bit fearful, but for some reason I thought it would just go away. I didn't know these streets very well, but what I did know was that I had to keep moving. As I quickly continued, the coyote slowly followed, keeping its distance still. But the darker it got, the more scared I became, and after walking down random neighborhood roads in the darkness for a while, I came to the horrifying realization that I was lost. All the turns had messed with my sense of direction, and I had no idea which way to go. Through the darkness, I could now see the glowing eyes of the beast, and could now hear it yipping and howling. As I walked further through the dark neighborhood streets, every few minutes another set of glowing eyes would appear behind me, and even more, louder howls. I could tell they were getting closer too. I was absolutely terrified at this point, trying to hold back my tears as I was panicking and fearing for both mine and my dog's life. Every once in a while, I'd pass a streetlight and look behind me, revealing the entire pack walking slowly with their heads down, watching my every move. After almost 45 minutes of being followed, I began tiring, and I knew I was far from the safety of my home. Maggie began whimpering louder too, which made me even more emotional as I knew that she was aware of what may soon happen. The howling and yipping became more frequent, growing louder and closer. I looked back one more time to see all of their eyes staring at me from only 30 to 40 feet away. But suddenly and strangely, they all began to separate, moving to the sides of the road. A few moments later, a small car slowly makes its way between the crowd of coyotes and stops right next to me. A lady rolls down her window and asked me if I needed help. I was so thankful for her and told her to please take me home. There are almost no circumstances in which I would willingly get into a stranger's car, but I really had no other choice. The lady was really nice and seemed terrified for me. I was crying at this point, knowing I had just been moments away from a grueling attack. She kindly dropped me off at my house, which was almost 20 minutes from where she picked me up. I live in a nice neighborhood, one where you don't have to worry about your house being broken into or carjackings. The only growing problem in our neighborhood, and many neighboring ones as well, is coyotes. It's been a few years since this incident happened to me, and as time went on, there became more and more showing up around town, getting bigger and stronger. The public knows to be cautious, especially in parks where there are tons of trees and places for them to make home. Signs were put up letting people know of the popular areas where anywhere between 3 and 20 have been spotted. There have been news stories coming out, such as groups of coyotes leaping over fences and taking small dogs, and larger animals being found torn apart in kids' parks. Very sad stories, and some even a little scary. But you never think of coyotes as being an immediate danger until you're being followed in the middle of the night by a pack of the hungry and merciless. I used to work the register at a local gas station, though I've since left as there were a lot of strange things that happened when I would work overnight. But this one situation in particular will stick with me forever. I only worked the night shift a few days a week, usually Friday and Saturday. My shifts were usually boring and honestly just a game of trying to stay awake. The only thing I really had to do was stock the shelves and occasionally help a customer. I would get a lot of drunk people or families on road trips, and sometimes even whole groups of friends. But for the most part, it was pretty quiet. On this night, it was around 2 a.m., and I hadn't had a customer in over an hour, so I was starting to doze off a little bit. The desk was around the corner from the entrance, and there was a bell on the door that rang when somebody walked in, so usually falling asleep wasn't too big of a deal. I woke up after a few minutes, hearing the bell ring, and a few seconds later saw a customer walk in. He looked like a typical 30-year-old man that would come in for some beer or a snack. He walked around for a little bit, down every aisle, looking at everything. Now, I've worked in retail for a long time, and I know what it looks like when someone is looking for something specific. But this man had nothing in mind. He was just looking at the shelves, browsing the store. During the day, this is pretty normal, but people don't usually come in at 2 a.m. to browse the gas station shelves. I looked out the window to my left to see if he was filling up his car and was maybe just passing the time, but there were no cars outside. A couple minutes went by before he eventually looked over at me and said thanks, and then walked out. I didn't know what to make of that, but I just figured he stole something small and was just being a dick about it. The whole situation left my mind after a few minutes, and I started to get really tired again. This time, I decided to grab my cart of items to stock and start filling up the shelves to pass the time. I'm not really sure how long I was stocking for, maybe 20 minutes, before I saw a man show up at the end of the aisle I was stocking. It made me jump a little, as I never heard the door ring. This guy was wearing a large hoodie and dark clothes. I pretty much knew right away that something was very off. The man continued down to the back of the store, and I immediately went back to behind the counter. I tried not to stare, but I noticed that as he walked down the aisles, he wasn't looking for anything. He was just browsing. It clicked in my head immediately that this was the same guy from just a little bit ago, but he had changed clothes for some reason. I also came to the realization that he probably came initially to scope out the place before doing whatever he planned on doing. I started to panic in my head. The man began to come down the aisle closest to the counter, and I could see something heavy in his front hoodie pocket. I made a split-second decision to try and prevent any further escalation, and I said, "Welcome back, sir. Need help finding anything?" He made eye contact with me, and I could tell he knew exactly what I was trying to do. He approached the counter, not saying a word, and brought his hand out of his pocket, revealing a small handgun. Then he grabbed a small pack of gum from beside the counter and placed it in front of me. He said, "Just this." Confused and in shock as to what was happening, I didn't even react for a few seconds before eventually scanning the gum nervously. Still holding the gun, he took out $1 from his jean pocket and threw it on the counter, then said thanks and walked out. I was in total shock, trying to wrap my head around what just happened. I ended up reporting the situation to the police and calling my manager, who didn't pick up. No updates ever came out of the situation, but it had me on edge for the last few months that I worked there. I'm still unsure of what really happened that night, or what the man's intentions were, but honestly, I'm glad I never found out. I work at a Montessori school, which is basically just a really small school with 3 to 4 very tiny classrooms for children. Where I work, the classrooms are on the lower level of a church, and my job is to clean them every night after the classes. It would only take me around 2 hours to clean all the rooms, but I work the closing shift at a nearby grocery store as well, so I wouldn't get to the school until around 10:30 most nights. Something you should also know is that the church shared a parking lot with an old people's home directly across from it. I will admit, a lot of weird and creepy things have happened at this school, but the weirdest had to be what happened just a couple weeks back. I had just finished cleaning the second room and was beginning to move all of my cleaning supplies to the third room. It was probably around 11:45 at this time, which meant that I was running a little bit behind, so I was trying to rush. As I crossed the hallway to the third room, I hear loud bells echoing throughout the church upstairs. Someone had rung the doorbell. Nobody has ever shown up during any of my shifts before, as it was always so late, and both the school and the church were closed hours before. I was a little nervous, so I slowly made my way up the stairs and towards the door. It was one of those wooden doors with big tinted glass windows on it. Trying not to be seen, I looked around the corner to see who was outside. I saw an old woman, probably in her 70s or 80s, just standing right outside the door. I backed away before she could notice me. I decided to ignore it and figured she had just wandered off and one of the attendants at the old people's home would pick her up. I started my cleaning again, mopping the floors of the room. But only a few minutes later, I heard banging echo through the halls. I jumped a little. Then I stopped to listen. The banging stopped for a few seconds and was followed by the old lady yelling from outside. It was hard to make out what she was saying, so I made my way back upstairs, where I could hear clearly what she was calling out for. She was calling for someone named Abby. She was just repeating her name over and over. As I got closer to the door, the woman stopped. I looked around the corner and she wasn't outside the door anymore. It was a little bit unsettling, but I assured myself that someone probably came and got her after they heard her yelling. I turned around and began my way back, when out of the corner of my eye I see the old lady staring at me through the window right beside the stairs. She looked me in the eyes and yelled, "Abby, help me." Her eyes were wide open and her hair was long and gray. I immediately ran back downstairs and locked myself in one of the classrooms. I took my phone out and called the old people home next door, and I told them the situation, asking if maybe she'd wandered away from them. The lady on the line told me that everyone was there, and they would have noticed if anyone had left, as they're required to check out. She said that she would double check with security and to stay on the line just in case. While I waited, I heard banging on the window upstairs, and a few seconds later, the woman on the phone describes the old lady's features and asks if that was her. I said yes and mentioned that she keeps yelling for someone named Abby. There was a small moment of silence. "Ma'am?" I spoke softly back into the phone. She replied, warning me not to approach her and to find somewhere safe to stay until they could have someone come out and get her. Obviously, this just made me even more terrified. I stayed in the room, still listening to the repeated banging on the window from upstairs. Now, this building was pretty old, and I wasn't sure how long those windows would hold if she kept banging on them. Eventually, I heard some male voices from outside, and after what sounded like a struggle, they left. I sat there for a few minutes, just thinking about what had happened. Then I got up and finished cleaning the rooms. The whole situation felt pretty unreal, and knowing that the old lady is in the building across from me still makes me nervous. I never found out who Abby was, or why the lady was trying to get into the church, but I'm just glad I never opened the door.
I like to start off this story by saying that you're always better safe than sorry. I listen to horror stories all the time, but I never thought that I would be sharing my own. For privacy reasons, I will be changing the names in my story. My name is Jessica and I'm 15. I would like to think that I'm a very cautious person. I live in Ireland in a big suburban neighborhood. I usually like to go on walks almost every day. It's nice to go outside every once in a while during this pandemic. It started off like any typical day. I got up at around 8 a.m., went to get some coffee, did some workouts before school. Around this time, a snowstorm was approaching my country, so it was very cold outside, and it got dark around 5 p.m. After I got done with an exhausting day of school, I went down to go watch some TV in my living room. Shortly after, I got bored and decided to go on a walk. It was snowing outside, and it looked really nice for a walk. When I left my house, I didn't bring my dog with me. He could be quite annoying to walk at times, and I just wanted to enjoy myself. As I was walking down a long stretch of sidewalk, it was about 4:30 p.m. at this point, and it was starting to get dark. I'm the type of person who's very perceptive, and also paranoid. I think it's good to be a little paranoid sometimes, as it could possibly save you in certain situations. I look up to see this man walking past me. I've seen this man around my village before, and he's always given me the creeps. I always get this weird vibe whenever he's around. Other times when I've walked past him, he stares daggers at me, with an unsettling grin on his face. I don't want to be too judgmental, but I think that he may have something wrong with him. So as he walks past me, I keep my head down to avoid eye contact, but I can see from the corner of my eye that he is staring at me. I keep walking, but I suddenly had an urge to turn around. As I did, I saw him just looking at me. It made me feel extremely uncomfortable. To describe this man, he is about 6 feet tall, looks to be in his mid-40s. His hair was in a tight man bun, and he always seemed to be wearing the same clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt with dirty shoes. My heart started beating fast, so I turned back around and continued walking. Over the next 10 minutes, I could feel him watching me, which meant that he was most likely following me as well. I turned around again to confirm my worst fears. There he was, still staring me down like some kind of creepy statue at a Halloween store. We made eye contact for about 5 seconds before I felt my fight-or-flight instinct kick in. My mind scrambled, trying to figure out what to do. He was only a few meters behind me and closing in. I came to a junction and waited for the light to give me the signal to cross the road. There weren't many streetlights on this road, which made me feel even more uncomfortable. While I was waiting there, I heard the man walking closer to me. I was hoping that he would just pass by me, but that wasn't the case. "Hey there." I turned around to face him and just gave him an awkward smile without saying a word. As I crossed the road, he kept close behind me. Hey there," he said again. I offered a quick response. Hi," I spoke in a strong voice, without sounding too eager to talk to him. I kept on my way, but he followed me and continued the conversation. I'm trying to get rid of phones in my house. I'm trying to sell them off. Would you be interested in buying one?" As soon as he said that, I knew that I was in danger. This man wasn't going to leave me alone, and I knew he was lying. I may be young, but I'm not that stupid, so I just said, "No thank you. You have a nice day." And I kept walking. He continued to follow closely behind. I was now thinking about how unfortunate it was that my phone was broken, and therefore I couldn't contact anyone for help. So I began to internally panic. I turned a corner, and I noticed that there were no people or cars. It was then that I decided to make a break for it. I didn't look back. I just counted down in my head. 3, 2, 1. Run! I soon realized that I had made the correct decision when I heard the pounding of footsteps close behind me. I knew I shouldn't have, but I looked behind me one last time as I ran. The lighting wasn't the best, but I could clearly see that he was holding a large kitchen knife in one hand. I was so scared that my heart was practically beating out of my chest. I felt sick, but I had to think fast. The man was gaining on me. We were running through my village at this point, and I could see some bystanders in the distance. That's when the unthinkable happened. I felt a cold object strike my back. After a few more steps, I could feel my blood make its way down my spine. That's not a figure of speech either. This lunatic had stabbed me. I staggered a bit, but I kept running even though I was badly injured and bleeding. Fortunately for me, there was a small police station just across the road from my neighborhood. Knowing that this was a life or death situation, I sped towards the police outpost. Once I got to the entryway, I looked back to see the man running in the opposite direction. I ran inside, completely hysterical. 2 police officers immediately came to my aid. One of them called an ambulance, while the other applied pressure to my wound. I frantically told them about the man and tried to explain what happened. The ambulance arrived and took me to the hospital. I was in shock and so overwhelmed by the whole situation. None of it felt real. Fortunately, the stab wound wasn't that deep, and I have since made a full recovery. I gave a detailed description of the man and mentioned that I had seen him around before. He must have fled somewhere far away, because to my knowledge, they never caught him. That was the very last time I ever took a walk by myself. Just to clarify, I'm a 22-year-old female, but at the time, I was only 14. I was in middle school, and I had made some plans to hang out with some friends at the town's park. It was probably around 5 p.m., but it was such a long time ago that I'm not entirely sure how accurate that is. The town I lived in was very small. You could drive right through it within about a minute, and it was gone. I used to walk around everywhere, to the store, to the school, and to the park. I lived only a couple blocks from there, and I didn't have a cell phone back in those days. I messaged my friends on the computer and told them that I would be heading that way after I fixed my hair. They told me that they would be heading that way as well. I tell my mom that I'm going to hang out with my friends, and was in a hurry as she shouted at me to come home before dark, since I still had homework I had to do. It was bright, sunny, and the weather was nice. I walked a little ways, and right before I got to the park gate, a white truck stopped at a nearby stop sign. The driver was a man in a white shirt and a baseball cap. He looked to be in his late 30s to early 40s. He looked over at me. I give him a small, awkward smile and a little wave. He smiles back at me and waves before continuing to drive up the road and pulls into the Sonic drive-in that was just up the street. I didn't think much of it at the time and entered the park alone. Scanning the area, I didn't see my friends, so I found shade under a tree by the swings. It was a couple of feet away from a gazebo. I didn't understand why the park was completely empty. Our park was always full of kids and families, but there was nothing. It was quiet and empty. I waited patiently for my friends to arrive, just daydreaming under the trees. That's when I hear a vehicle pull into the small parking lot. I look up and I see that it's the same white truck from before, and the same man steps out. He's holding a bag of fast food as he makes his way to the gazebo, only a couple of feet away from where I'm at. And the entire time he's staring me down. It was the kind of stare that made your skin crawl, unblinking and relenting. I had an immediate gut feeling that something was wrong, and my skin began to itch. He didn't take his eyes off me for a second, not even when he was tearing into his meal. I spent a while fiddling with my bracelets and praying to God that my friends would arrive soon. I looked over at him again. He nodded and then motioned for me to come over. He did this repeatedly. I shook my head and tried to keep my eyes off him, but I was starting to become scared, thinking that he may come over to me. I kept glancing over at him, and every time I did, I was met with the same unrelenting stare. 20 minutes had passed since he arrived, and my friends were nowhere in sight. I began to get this feeling that they weren't coming. I was alone in a park with a creepy man who was much taller, bigger, and stronger than me. These thoughts flooded my brain, and that's when I noticed that we weren't alone. There was a girl with long brown hair sitting by the slides. She was a couple of feet from my left. She looked only a bit older than me. She called me over, and I felt a lot safer coming up to her than I did that creep sitting over by the gazebo. As I approached her, she asked me if that man sitting over by the gazebo was my dad. I couldn't contain my fear any longer, and started frantically explaining to her that the man was not my dad, and that he was really creeping me out. I could sense that she felt a bad vibe from the situation, just as a bystander, seeing the way the man was looking at me, as if I was a piece of meat. I told her that I was only 14, and that I was supposed to meet some friends at the park, but they didn't show. I then mentioned to her that the man had motioned for me to come over to him several times. She told me that she had just got off work and was waiting for a ride from a friend who lived pretty far away. She had been watching us both for some time, feeling that something was off. I thanked her for calling out to me and was relieved to have someone with me. She sat there with me and kept an eye on the man. We made casual conversation about school and other stuff. This went on for about 15 minutes. All the while, the both of us kept constantly checking to see if the man was still there. He was, and was still staring daggers at me. He wasn't eating anymore. He was just sitting there and staring. I was so uncomfortable, shifting my position every time I noticed him. My face was hot, and I was feeling sick to my stomach. I glanced over again to see him motion once more for me to come over. I could see his eyes light up, and his smile becoming wide. The girl gets irritated by this. I watched her stand up quickly and stomp down the steps and walks over to the gazebo. From where I was on the slides, I could see them talking loudly back and forth. I was able to make out the guy saying, "That little bitch led me on." He repeated this over and over again, saying that I was some kind of slut that led him on, saying that he never would have tried to get me over to him if he had known that I was a kid. I was a tiny thing. There's no way that anyone would have mistaken me for an adult. She came back and told me that I should head home, and she would keep an eye on him as I left the park. And since I lived pretty close, I would have to make the trip home fast, so he wouldn't see what street I lived on. I bolted out of the park as fast as I could. As I did, I could hear a vehicle's engine rev up. I saw the white truck peeling out of the parking lot and turn onto the same street that I was on. At that point, I knew the man was following me. I saw the truck begin to pick up speed. That's when I ran between the two houses just off to my left. I then hid behind some thick bushes. I got low so I could still see what was happening in the street. The truck stopped in front of the alleyway, and I could see the man sticking his head out of the window, presumably looking for me. I then heard a female voice yell, "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" The man shouted back, "Hey, I told you to mind your own business. If I ever see you or that little bitch again, you're dead. You hear me? You're dead." The man revved up his engine and drove off. I ran home as fast as I could. When I got through the door, tears began to burn my eyes, and I broke down sobbing. I told my family what happened. We all went back up to the park sometime later, but the man and the truck were gone. A couple of days later, I found out my cousin went to work at the same drive-in that the man had been at. She heard a crazy story from her coworker about how they had saved a little girl's life from a pedophile at the park. Like I said, our town was really small. I found out her name was Cheyenne, and to this day I'm so grateful that she was there to protect me. She was my guardian angel that day. I don't know what would have happened to me if she had not been there, and the thought of me being stuffed into that guy's truck keeps me awake at night. I would like to remain anonymous for reasons that will become obvious. This happened about 5 years ago, when I was 16. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I was an asshole back then. Me and my friends were a bunch of idiots who robbed, sold dope, and partied like rock stars. The area that we were in shall remain nameless, but I will say it was in Canada. One day I went to this guy's house. Let's just say he was a friend of a friend. He wanted to buy some electronics off me that I had recently come into possession of. We'll call this guy Mike. Now, Mike was this fat white dude, I would say in his late 30s. I knew all about Mike because of his reputation. He was constantly in and out of prisons for various reasons, mostly drug-related and assault charges. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Why the hell would I be associating with a dangerous guy like this? The answer is about what you would expect. I was just a young, stupid kid. I went into his house with a friend because I needed help loading the stuff inside, and I also needed to show him that everything was working properly. Mike asked, "How much?" I gave him a price. I can't recall the exact amount I was asking for, but he obviously didn't like what he heard. "I'm not paying that much, kid. 400 is the best you're gonna do." We argued back and forth for a little while, until my friend chimed in. "Hey, fat ass, quit f***ing us around and give us our money, or you can go f*** yourself." Mike then grabbed a chrome handgun out of the cushion of his couch and pointed it at us. He cocked the hammer back and shouted, "Okay then, get the f*** out of my house, you little bastards." We left and took the merchandise with us. We drove off laughing about the whole thing. Inside I was losing my cool because I had just had a gun in my face. After we hid the merchandise, I headed home. Later that night, I went to a house party with my girlfriend and spent some time drinking and smoking weed, until my girlfriend wanted me to take her home. We were both pretty intoxicated when we started walking back to her place. Along the way, we had to stop so she could take her shoes off. That's when I heard from behind me, "Surprise!" Then a loud bang. I grabbed my girlfriend and ducked down behind a car as more shots rang out. That's when I realized that my girlfriend had been shot in the chest. She was still alive, but was going into shock. I put my hand over her wound and kept telling her that it was going to be all right. The shooter made his way around the car, and that's when I saw that it was Mike. There was a second gunman with a sawed-off shotgun with a bandana around his face directly behind him. Mike ripped my girlfriend away from me and pointed the gun at my face. I begged and pleaded with him. "Mike, dude, she's got nothing to do with this. Let her go." "Damn shame, kid. She's cute." He aimed his gun at her head, and anger completely overtook me. I charged at him screaming, but before I could do anything, I was hit in the back of the head by the man with the shotgun. And Mike turned his gun on me and said, "Your turn." By a stroke of luck, a few of my friends came out of nowhere and began shooting at them. I stayed down, and when the shooting stopped, they were gone. The next few hours are a blur to me. I vaguely remember talking to the cops and somebody telling my girlfriend's family what happened. I can only imagine how crushing it must have been for them. I was eventually released, and as soon as I got back home, I took a nosedive straight into a bottle of whiskey until I passed out. A few days later, the police caught up with Mike and his asshole friend. After that whole ordeal, it made me start reevaluating my life. I'm a much different person today, and it's a good thing too, because most of the people I knew back then are either dead or in prison. My name is Alice, and I had a terrifying experience with my little sister when I was about 9 or 10 years old. My family and I lived in a small housing community that had 2 schools. My town's junior high school was less than a mile from the edge of the last row of houses. Across the street was the elementary school and a park. This experience happened just outside of the junior high school building. There was a bunch of old concrete slabs that were dumped there to be later disposed of. My sister and I were jumping and playing on these concrete slabs, and our bikes were laid out by some other debris. I noticed a dark green, or maybe black, Saturn coupe. It drove slowly down the street before screeching its tires. The driver then turned the car in our direction. As soon as I noticed this, even in my young mind, it was really suspicious to me. I made it obvious that I noticed them, hoping that they would just go to the skate park that was down the street. I didn't panic my sister too much just yet, until I saw the car slowly approaching us. Now my sister and I are very used to that area, and we play there all the time. We always rode our bikes along that strip of sidewalk in front of the school. and that vehicle was pretty much staying alongside that sidewalk. I started thinking about where we could go to get back home safely, and I told my sister to stop playing and get on her bike. I remember telling her that the vehicle was suspicious, and they may not have good intentions. I knew I couldn't defend my sister from some grown man if it came down to it. We had our bike stolen before, so I kind of thought that's what they were after. As we got back on our bikes, I saw the car begin to pick up speed as it made its way towards us. I was attending the elementary school that was just up the street, and it was the only place I could think of to go, since it was obvious at this point that whoever was in the car was definitely after us. My sister and I were pretty fast at riding our bikes, so I told my sister to pedal as fast as she possibly could. We got to the elementary school in the nick of time. The car pulled in after us as we stopped in the middle of the parking lot. My heart almost stopped when I first looked at the parking lot and saw that there was only one car left. It was one of my teachers, and he was packing up his vehicle. This is what I was counting on, that there would be a teacher left on campus or maybe a security guard. The car noticed that there was a teacher behind us, and they drove past slowly with the window rolled down. I remember trying to identify a face, but I only caught a glimpse of the driver's arm as they sped away. I looked at my sister and back at that teacher. I silently thanked him. I knew a way around the back of the elementary school. It led to an apartment area, which we could go through to get home. My sister doesn't remember feeling traumatized after that incident, but I remember lying in bed trying to sleep, so distraught over what happened and how scared I was. I didn't tell my parents until I literally became sick from holding it in. It's never a good idea to bottle these kinds of things up. My mother didn't really seem too concerned over what happened, but let's just say that things were different for my family back in those days. And we'll leave it at that. My lesson learned was to always trust when you feel something isn't right. And if I didn't take that situation seriously, me and my sister probably would have ended up on a milk carton. I used to work at a fast food restaurant that primarily serves chicken and is closed on Sundays. Its employees are also known for saying, "My pleasure." I'm sure you can guess what restaurant I'm talking about. Most of the time, I really loved my job. At one point, I even wanted to work at the corporate office in Georgia. But there was one incident while I was working there that really unnerved me, and it still freaks me out thinking back on it. At the end of the night, I always had to clean the bathrooms, mop the floors, wash the dustpans, and hang them up along with the brooms. Then I would have to take out the garbage to the dumpster out back. Then I was free to go. So I had finished all my cleaning duties, and all I had left to do was take out the trash. It was around 10:50 p.m. I was really tired and ready to go home. It had been a long workday. I had been there since 2:30, and my boyfriend, who works in the kitchen, said he wanted to grab a bite to eat on the way back home. I told myself to take care of things quickly, so we could get out of there as fast as possible. There were 3 trash bags, so I figured I would take 2 trips. I would take 2 on the first trip, and 1 on the second. This restaurant has a policy where people are supposed to take out the trash in teams of 2, but the managers and myself figured that it wasn't really a big deal. We live in a suburb about 40 miles from Los Angeles. Nothing really happened around here, and it was common for us to take out the trash alone. I walked to the dumpster with the 2 bags. When I got there, I heard a small noise. It was a rustling sound. I stayed quiet, figuring that I would hear the noise again, but all was silent. I tossed the bags in the dumpster, and as I walked away, I thought I heard the noise again. I hoped that it wasn't a rat or something, not that I was afraid of them, but no restaurant wants those things around. I went back inside and grabbed the last bag. I took it to the dumpster again. I then heard another noise. It was as if someone was rummaging. I threw the bag in the dumpster and decided that I would investigate. If it was a rat, then we would have to set traps in the morning. I grabbed my phone from my back pocket and used it as a flashlight. I went around the dumpster to look behind it. What I saw was much, much worse than a rodent. Behind the dumpster was a hooded figure. They appeared to be on their knees, holding what looked like a dead animal carcass. Perhaps a rat or a dead bird. I could hear a disgusting wet crunching sound coming from the figure. I gasped and jumped back. The figure's head instantly looked towards me. It lowered its meal, and as it did, a piece of animal flesh fell out of its mouth. From where I was standing, I couldn't see the person's face, but I could certainly hear their deep, raspy voice as they said,
"My, you're so beautiful. I wonder how good you taste."
Without a second thought, I turned around and ran to the restaurant. My boyfriend was at the front counter clocking out for the night. I ran to him and tried to tell him what happened, but I was hysterical and started to cry. My manager came up from the front office and I eventually told him what happened. The two of them ran out and tried to catch the guy, but they were too late. There was no one behind the dumpster area. And unfortunately, there was also no security cameras back there, so there wasn't much we could do besides call 911 and warn them of a creepy, possibly cracked out homeless man who was running around eating roadkill. After that incident, the restaurant got very strict about having people go out in teams of 2 to take out the garbage. Even in the daylight, surveillance cameras were also installed. I still worked in the same restaurant some time after that, but ended up leaving for reasons unrelated to this incident. Ever since that night, I'm much more cautious about my surroundings, especially when I'm by myself.
In September of 2020, a 20-year-old Australian university student posted a harrowing personal account to the popular social media site, Reddit. In it, she detailed the terrifying ordeal she'd been subjected to after posting intimate pictures of herself on a social media page known as OnlyFans, one involving obsessive stalking, internet loopholes, and ultimately, a clear and present threat to her life. Only through a completely anonymous throwaway account did she feel safe enough to share her story, adding that her local police force had finally taken action against the person responsible. But even then, the girl made it clear that her complaints should have been taken seriously long before she was in any imminent danger. According to the girl, the incidents all started after she moved back with her parents during the summer break. The girl was particularly excited to be home as the family had just bought a new puppy. By all accounts, the girl was having a ball getting to know her new furry friend. But as anyone who's ever had a puppy will tell you, to say they can be erratic would be the understatement of the century. One night, the girl awoke to hear her puppy yelping at the back door. They were in the middle of potty training, but the pup didn't quite have the hang of it yet. So she climbed out of bed, put on her slippers, and went downstairs to let the dog out. She says it was as late as 2 a.m., and there didn't seem to be another soul around as she stepped down into the night. But she soon found that she wasn't entirely alone. "I saw this figure in a car," she said. "I could tell they were looking at me, but it was pitch black outside, and I couldn't make out their face. I felt a bit uneasy, but I didn't really think anything of it. Only when I go back inside, the car started up and followed me up my driveway." The terror of such an experience is undeniable, and even though the girl was so close to home, there's no denying that being out alone in the middle of the night made her very vulnerable indeed. "I was terrified," the girl added. "I sprinted back inside and locked the door, and kept an eye out for them in case they tried to break in. But as far as I know, they just backed out of our driveway and left." When she woke up the following morning, after a terrible night of restless sleep and deep concern, the girl found an envelope inside her parents' letterbox. The envelope contained not only $20 Australian in cash, but also her OnlyFans username. "I thought long and hard about how he could have found my parents' address," the girl said, "and I worked out that the problems didn't start until I shared my Amazon wish list." OnlyFans and Amazon were both adamant that their security systems prevent leaks like that from taking place. However, it appeared that wasn't the issue, as third-party sellers are not bound to the same data protection laws as large multinational companies. Although she doesn't know for certain how her stalker got her address, the girl is 90% sure that they got in touch with a third-party seller and obtained her home address in that way. Whether it was money, coercion, or intimidation that caused the seller to give up the info is another question entirely, but the fact remains that it's the most likely of all explanations. After that, When I moved back to the college town where I was studying, I stopped posting content, the girl goes on to explain. But somehow my stalker still managed to track me down. The girl said she basically closed down her OnlyFans account, then started a YouTube account because of how unsafe the former felt. Her first big vlogging project was due to be a shopping trip to a local mall, but when she got to her car to depart for the day, she found it had been ransacked. The vlogging camera was missing too, she said. I know, it's my fault for leaving it in the car, but I was using it the night before, and since I lived in a gated area, I didn't think I would be unsafe. Yet she added that the camera was inside of her glove box and contained an SD card with unreleased photos and videos on it. It was almost like someone knew it was there, but as bad as that was, it only got weirder from there. She eventually contacted her building security personnel, asking if they could review security camera footage from the previous few nights. And it was through this that not only did she see a man break into her car and ignore other cars in the parking lot, but she also had proof she was being deliberately singled out for targeted harassment. After they got the camera, they walked around the duplex until stopping near my window, the girl wrote. My bedroom faces an outside street and the blinds are broken, so it's very easy to see in. I have a curtain, but it doesn't cover my window all the way. Look, what I'm trying to say is, this person watched me sleep for an hour or so. I have no idea why they didn't try to break in, but thank God they didn't. The woman explained her camera was later recovered at a nearby secondhand store, suggesting whoever is stalking her has a prior history of criminality. However, she added that the camera's memory card was missing. I know he kept it as some kind of trophy. I just know it, she added, and has since moved and hopes her stalker hasn't followed. I believe the police are still trying to track them down, but I have broken my lease and moved to a new place, so hopefully this will keep me safe. But what's so scary about the girl's story is that it seems like only a matter of time before this stalker decides to take things further. Unless they're caught, stalkers will only ever escalate their activities until their obsession reaches a deadly and permanent end.